While I was at the bank holding a pen over a loan document that would sign away my life, my phone vibrated. My neighbor Loretta was frantic. She asked if I was moving. I told her no, I was at the bank with my daughter. Her next words made my blood run cold. She said a crew of men was loading my entire house into a moving truck. I lowered the phone and shot a look at my daughter's husband. He immediately looked away. I realized right then my own family was robbing me blind. My name is Jermaine. I am 68 years old, a retired master builder who constructed an empire from the ground up. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. I sat in the plush leather chair of the bank manager's office. Cynthia, the branch manager, slid the heavy guarantor contract across the mahogany desk. She tapped the signature line with a manicured finger. Beside me, my son-in-law Brent shifted his weight, his expensive Italian leather shoes tapping an impatient rhythm on the floor. He was a man who always assumed he deserved the wealth I bled for. My daughter Aaliyah sat on his left, her face stretched into a tight, forced smile that did not reach her eyes. They needed my signature to secure a massive cash-out refinance on their failing business, using my equity as collateral. The silver pen felt heavy in my calloused hand. I had spent 40 years swinging hammers and reading blueprints to build a life for my late wife, Nadine, and our daughter. I was seconds away from risking it all for a man I despised. Then my phone vibrated violently against my ribs. I pulled it from my pocket. Loretta, my neighbor of 20 years, was on the line. Her voice was an urgent, panicked hiss. She asked why a massive moving truck was backed into my driveway. She described men carrying out Nadine's antique curio cabinet. I stopped breathing. I stared directly at Brent across the polished desk. Brent felt my gaze swallowed hard and immediately broke eye contact to check his gold watch. The silence in the room suddenly felt like a loaded weapon. They brought me here to trap me in paperwork while they stripped my sanctuary bare. The betrayal clicked into place with terrifying clarity. If I signed that paper, I would lose the equity I built with my bare hands in the home where I held Nadine as she took her last breath. I had to stop the transaction without showing my hand. I dropped the silver pen. It clattered loudly against the desk, rolling onto the floor. I slumped forward and grabbed the left side of my chest. I gasped for air, forcing my face to contort in agony. A severe angina attack was my only immediate escape. 10 years ago, a real heart attack nearly killed me. The bypass surgery left a massive scar down my sternum and gave me an undeniable medical alibi. I squeezed my eyes shut and let out a strained, ragged groan. Cynthia shrieked and shoved her chair back, shouting for her assistant to bring water and call an ambulance. I clutched my shirt, leaning heavily against the desk. I played the role of the frail, dying old man they assumed I was. The room erupted into chaos. The loan document sat completely ignored on the desk. The trap they had carefully laid for me was momentarily suspended by my theatrical agony. I breathed in shallow, ragged bursts, ensuring every person in that bank lobby believed my heart was failing. I needed them to think I was weak. Weakness was the perfect camouflage for what I was about to do. Brent cursed loudly under his breath, completely disregarding my supposed medical emergency. He slammed his hand against the armrest of his chair. Aaliyah rushed to my side, gripping my shoulder with a display of feigned concern, but her eyes darted furiously toward the unsigned contract. She was not worried about her father dying. She was worried about the money slipping away. I swatted the glass of water away when Cynthia's assistant brought it. I grabbed Brent by the lapel of his tailored suit, pulling him down to my level. I demanded he take me home immediately. I told him I did not want a hospital, I only wanted my own bed. Brent tried to argue, his face flushed with frustration. He actually suggested I just sign the paper quickly before the paramedics arrived. The sheer audacity of his greed wiped away any remaining shred of my paternal affection. I raised my voice, letting out a booming, desperate shout that echoed through the entire bank branch. I yelled that my chest was on fire and my son-in-law was denying me my home. Customers stopped in their tracks. Security guards stepped forward. Brent realized the public spectacle was destroying his polished reputation. Humiliated and cornered by dozens of judging eyes, he gritted his teeth and grabbed my arm. He pulled me up, his grip tight with suppressed rage, and half-dragged me toward the exit. He complied out of sheer embarrassment, unknowingly playing right into my hands. The ride home was thick with suffocating tension. Brent drove his luxury SUV recklessly, taking tight corners with white knuckles gripping the steering wheel. The silence in the car was heavier than concrete. I sat in the back seat, keeping my breathing labored and my eyes half closed. Aaliyah sat in the passenger seat, her fingers flying across her phone screen in a frantic blur. She did not realize I could see the reflection of her screen perfectly in the rearview mirror. I watched the text message she sent to the moving company foreman. She typed in all caps, ordering them to abort the job and leave the property immediately. She was desperate to hide the evidence of their looting before I arrived. Brent hit the gas, weaving through traffic to beat the inevitable confrontation. I kept my hand over my chest, plotting my exact sequence of retaliation. The engine roared as Brent made the final sharp turn onto my quiet suburban street. He slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching against the asphalt. He was too late. Parked directly in my driveway, blocking the entire path to my front door, was a massive idling moving truck. The ramp was deployed. The doors were wide open. The physical proof of their treachery sat right in front of us, impossible to deny and impossible to hide. I shoved the passenger door open before Brent even brought the SUV to a complete halt. My boots hit the concrete driveway with a heavy thud. The massive moving truck idled aggressively, pumping diesel fumes into the crisp afternoon air. The ramp rested on my front porch like a metallic tongue. The heavy oak front door, the one I had carved and hung myself 30 years ago, stood wide open. I bypassed the two men in gray jumpsuits carrying a stack of my moving boxes and walked straight into the foyer. My living room was a hollow shell. The vintage leather sofa I bought with my first major contracting bonus was gone. The antique mahogany dining table where my wife Nadine had hosted countless Thanksgiving dinners was gone. Worst of all, the corner where Nadine's glass curio cabinet used to sit was entirely empty. That cabinet held her grandmother's porcelain collection, the only thing she brought with her when we married. Brent stormed in right behind me, his voice booming with theatrical outrage. He threw his arms up and aggressively confronted the moving crew. He shouted demands, asking them who authorized this removal and threatening to call the authorities. He puffed out his chest, stepping squarely into the foreman's personal space. He played the role of the fiercely protective son-in-law to absolute perfection. I stood frozen in the center of the den, watching his performance. His feigned shock was a masterclass in deception. I did not intervene. I watched the men pause their work, confused by the sudden hostility from the man who had undoubtedly orchestrated their arrival. Brent yelled louder, making sure I could hear his supposed fury echoing off the bare walls of my looted home. The foreman wiped sweat from his brow and calmly pulled a yellow work order from his clipboard to defend his crew. He extended the paper toward me, but Brent lunged forward and snatched the document directly out of the man's hand. Brent scanned the paper with wide, dramatic eyes. He immediately crumpled the corner in his fist, loudly declaring this was a massive identity theft scam. He turned to me, swearing that some criminal organization had stolen my credentials to liquidate my estate. Aaliyah rushed through the front door right on cue. She took one look at the empty living room and burst into loud, performative sobs. She leaned her entire body weight against Brent, burying her face in his expensive suit jacket to hide her lack of actual tears. I ignored her weeping. My eyes dropped to the floor beneath my boots. Deep, jagged gouges scarred the length of the hallway. The movers had dragged the heavy oak furniture straight across the planks instead of lifting it. My chest tightened with genuine pain. I laid that Brazilian cherry hardwood by hand 40 years ago. I spent 3 weeks on my hands and knees measuring, cutting, and polishing every single plank. I did it to prove to Nadine's skeptical parents that a black carpenter with calloused hands could provide their daughter with a beautiful, respectable home. Those deep scratches felt like physical cuts across my own skin. They were a blatant desecration of the life I had built for my family. Aaliyah's fake sobbing echoed off the walls, contrasting sharply with the silent, permanent damage inflicted on the foundation of my home. The deception was sloppy, insulting, and utterly unforgivable. A younger, more volatile version of myself would have grabbed Brent by his collar and demanded the truth right there in the foyer. Instead, I forced my muscles to relax. I raised my trembling right hand and pressed it hard against my sternum. I let my shoulders slump forward, adopting the posture of a bewildered, terrified old man completely overwhelmed by the situation. I nodded slowly, looking at Brent with wide, fearful eyes. I told him he must be right about the identity theft. I let my voice shake, pleading with him to handle the police report because my heart could not take the stress of dealing with the authorities. Brent's arrogant smirk flashed for a fraction of a second before he masked it with grave concern. He eagerly agreed. He puffed his chest out again, assuring me he would take care of everything and keep the investigators away from my fragile state. He patted my shoulder with patronizing force, silently thrilled that his clumsy lie had worked so effortlessly. Aaliyah stepped away from her husband and wiped her dry eyes. She placed a hand on my arm, adopting a saccharine tone. She softly suggested that the empty house was unsafe and too traumatic for me to stay in. She insisted I needed professional observation tonight. She pushed the idea of checking into a temporary care facility, arguing that the medical staff could monitor my heart while they sorted out the burglary. They were trying to seamlessly pivot back to their original plan of institutionalizing me. They wanted me out of the house permanently before I could investigate the missing assets. I shook my head adamantly, playing the part of the stubborn senior citizen clutching to his familiar surroundings. I told Aaliyah I was not leaving my home, empty or not. I insisted I just needed a glass of water and complete silence to calm my racing pulse. I walked away from them, shuffling my feet across the ruined hardwood, and entered my master bedroom. The mattress was gone, leaving only the bare carpet. I shut the heavy wooden door behind me and locked the dead bolt. I stood silently in the center of the room, listening intently to the muffled voices in the hallway. 5 minutes later, the front door slammed shut. The heavy rumble of Brent's SUV engine faded down the street, followed closely by the grinding gears of the moving truck. As soon as the silence settled over the property, my fragile demeanor vanished completely. My spine straightened. The tremor in my hands stopped instantly. I strode directly to the walk-in closet at the back of the room. I dropped to my knees and wedged my fingers into the tight seam of the wooden baseboard beneath the window. With a sharp, practiced yank, I ripped the entire panel away from the drywall. I reached into the dark, dusty cavity between the studs to retrieve the heavy steel lockbox I had bolted to the joists 2 decades ago. My fingers brushed against bare insulation. I shoved my arm deeper, frantic, scraping my skin against exposed nails. The space was completely void. The lockbox containing the original deeds to every property I owned had been forcefully pried from the wall and stolen. I ran my calloused fingers along the rough edge of the exposed drywall. The hollow space where my steel lockbox used to sit felt like a physical wound. Brent had not just taken my furniture, he had taken my legacy. Inside that box were the original notarized deeds to every property I owned. Aaliyah always believed this suburban house was my only major asset. She viewed my entire construction career as a series of humble carpentry jobs. She never knew I took the profits from decades of bruised hands and aching joints to purchase 3 commercial lumber yards. Those yards operated under a blind corporate shell company I established long before she met her arrogant husband. I hid the wealth deliberately because I knew her entitlement would rot her soul if she thought she was an heiress. Brent assumed he was stealing the deed to a single piece of residential real estate. He had no idea he had just stolen the keys to a multi-million-dollar supply empire. I stood up, my knees cracking in the silent room. A glint of white paper caught my eye against the dark hardwood floor near the torn baseboard. I crouched down and picked it up. It was a crumpled thermal-printed receipt. Brent had dropped it in his frantic haste to pry my lockbox from the studs. I smoothed the paper out under the dim light of the hallway. It detailed a cash transaction for a secure offshore registered storage unit located on the industrial side of the county. The arrogant fool had literally left me a map to his crime. I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed Maxwell. He was a ruthless corporate attorney who treated legal warfare as a blood sport. He answered on the second ring despite the late hour. I bypassed the pleasantries entirely. I told him my house had been emptied and my hidden lockbox breached. I gave him the details of the stolen commercial deeds. I heard the sharp, frantic clacking of a keyboard through the receiver. Maxwell did not offer sympathy. He offered cold, hard facts. He informed me that a massive, hostile financial maneuver had been initiated that exact morning. Someone using my name and a forged power of attorney had contacted the primary holding bank for the lumberyards. Brent had submitted a request for a commercial cash-out refinance against the entire corporate portfolio. He was attempting to liquidate the equity of my life's work to cover whatever massive debts he was hiding behind his tailored suits. Maxwell explained that the bank placed a mandatory 48-hour hold on the transaction due to the sheer volume of the requested funds. Brent was running out of time. He needed me out of the picture permanently before the bank required my physical presence to verify the transfer. The stolen furniture was just a distraction. The real heist was happening on a corporate ledger. I instructed Maxwell to monitor the transfer, but strictly ordered him not to block it yet. I needed Brent to commit to the federal wire fraud on paper to ensure his absolute destruction. I hung up the phone and stepped out into the cool night air. The neighborhood was dead quiet. I walked across the manicured lawns to Loretta's house. She was waiting by her side door, her face tight with worry. I stepped into her kitchen and asked to see her security camera system. She led me to her computer monitor in the den. We pulled up the footage from early that morning. The high-definition video played out in cruel, undeniable clarity. I watched Brent's luxury SUV pull up to my curb. I watched the moving truck arrive shortly after. Then I watched my own daughter step out of the passenger side. Aaliyah walked up my front steps with purpose. She pulled her house key from her designer purse. She unlocked my front door and held it wide open for the moving crew. A few minutes later, the footage captured Brent standing by the truck ramp. He pulled a thick envelope from his jacket and counted out a stack of $100 bills. He handed the cash directly to the moving foreman. There was no misunderstanding. There was no massive identity theft scam. My daughter had actively and willingly participated in the looting of my home. She did not look coerced. She looked eager. The betrayal settled in my stomach like a block of lead. I was watching my own blood strip me of my dignity for a man who viewed me as nothing but an expired checkbook. I asked Loretta to print high-resolution screenshots of the video. She handed me the warm papers from her printer, her eyes full of silent pity. I folded the images and placed them in my inner coat pocket. As I walked back across the dark street to my empty house, my phone chimed with an automated alert. I opened the email. It was a notification from my health insurance provider. The message confirmed that an authorized representative had successfully changed my primary care physician. I read the name of the new doctor. My blood ran cold. Maxwell had warned me about this specific physician months ago during a routine estate planning meeting. This doctor ran a highly questionable private clinic specializing in rapid, aggressive cognitive assessments. He was notorious in legal circles for rubber-stamping severe dementia diagnoses for families eager to seize control of elderly relatives' estates. The pieces of Brent's master plan finally locked together. The stolen furniture, the forged refinance request, and now this sudden medical appointment. They were going to drag me into that clinic tomorrow morning. They planned to walk out with a legally binding medical document declaring me mentally incompetent. That piece of paper would grant Brent absolute control over my life, my finances, and my freedom. The trap was set for dawn. I walked into my hollow bedroom, sat on the bare floor, and prepared to play the most dangerous role of my life. The sharp knock on my front door came exactly at 6 in the morning. I had not slept a single minute. I sat on the bare carpet of my empty bedroom watching the sun drag its pale light across the gouged hardwood floor. I stood up, rolled my shoulders back to release the tension, and then forced my posture to slump into a curve of defeat. I opened the door to find Aaliyah and Brent standing on my porch. Brent held a cardboard tray of coffees, his tailored suit completely out of place in the early morning dew. Aaliyah held a paper bag smelling of warm croissants. Their smiles were blindingly bright and utterly hollow. Aaliyah stepped inside and kissed my cheek, her expensive perfume failing to mask the stench of her betrayal. She spoke in a soft, patronizing tone, treating me like a fragile, confused child. She announced they had booked a sudden appointment with a top-tier cardiovascular specialist to check on my heart after yesterday's tremendous stress. She squeezed my arm, claiming she just wanted her father to be healthy. I knew exactly who this specialist was. Maxwell had warned me about the corrupt neurologist masquerading as a concerned physician for greedy heirs. I did not confront her. I let my hands tremble slightly as I took the coffee cup from Brent. I lowered my gaze to the floor and nodded slowly, adopting the persona of a terrified, obedient old man whose spirit had been completely broken by a home invasion. Brent shared a quick, victorious glance with his wife. They believed I was utterly defeated, ready to be led to the slaughter without a single fight. I grabbed my worn wool coat from the hook by the door. I walked out to Brent's waiting SUV, perfectly playing the part of the compliant victim while mentally calculating every step of their impending ruin. The clinic sat tucked away in a high-end corporate park deliberately hidden from the main medical district. The doctor, a man with a slicked-back hairline and a disturbingly smooth voice, spoke to me as if I lacked basic human comprehension. He did not ask a single question about my heart. He asked about the date, the current president, and my daily morning routine. Before I could even open my mouth to answer, Brent dominated the conversation. He leaned over the doctor's mahogany desk, aggressively painting a portrait of a mind in rapid, tragic decay. Brent claimed I constantly forgot the names of my own relatives, wandered aimlessly around the neighborhood at midnight, and handed out large sums of cash to random strangers on the street. To seal the lie, Aaliyah pulled a thick folder from her designer bag. She produced a stack of final notice utility bills and property tax warnings. I stared at the papers spread across the desk. I recognized the formatting immediately. I had meticulously paid every bill on time for 40 years, utilizing the exact accounting skills that built my commercial lumber empire from scratch. Aaliyah had fabricated those late notices on her home computer. The doctor turned his gaze back to me, asking me to count backward from 100 by sevens. I looked at the blank wall clock. I let a vacant, lost expression wash over my face. I counted slowly, inserting a deliberate slight hesitation after every third number. I stumbled intentionally on the simplest math, the very same math I used to calculate load-bearing structural beams decades ago. I played the role of the decaying patriarch flawlessly. Aaliyah wiped away a non-existent tear. The doctor nodded with profound manufactured sympathy, scribbling furiously on his prescription pad. The doctor closed his leather-bound portfolio with a dramatic, rehearsed sigh. He announced his preliminary assessment with practiced solemnity. He declared I was suffering from a rapid onset of advanced cognitive decline and required immediate round-the-clock supervision. He handed an official medical certificate directly to Brent, completely bypassing me as if I were already a ghost in the room. Brent snatched the document, a triumphant smirk breaking through his mask of false concern. That single piece of paper was the weapon they needed to secure power of attorney and liquidate my hidden assets. As Brent eagerly reviewed the forged diagnosis, I reached into the deep pocket of my wool coat. My thumb found the side button on my phone. I pressed it exactly 3 times. That was the prearranged signal. Miles away in his downtown office, Maxwell received the alert. My cutthroat attorney did not waste a single second. With the push of a button, Maxwell filed a massive, preemptive legal injunction directly with the state medical board. The filing contained a mountain of documented evidence exposing this specific doctor's long history of issuing fraudulent dementia diagnoses in exchange for under-the-table kickbacks from impatient heirs. Maxwell tied the injunction explicitly to my name, ensuring that any legal document bearing this doctor's signature would instantly trigger a federal fraud investigation. Brent folded the medical certificate and slid it into his breast pocket, entirely oblivious to the fact that he was now carrying radioactive legal evidence. They thought they had secured the key to my empire. They had actually just handcuffed themselves to a sinking ship, and I was holding the only life raft. We exited the clinic into the bright mid-morning sun. Brent practically skipped toward his SUV, the heavy medical certificate burning a hole in his pocket. I climbed into the back seat, keeping my head bowed and my hands folded neatly in my lap. Brent merged onto the highway, but he did not take the exit that led back to my quiet suburban street. He drove in the exact opposite direction, navigating toward a sprawling gated complex nestled behind tall iron fences. The sign out front read, "Whispering Pines Luxury Assisted Living." Brent parked the vehicle near the main entrance and ordered me out. Aaliyah refused to make eye contact with me, keeping her gaze glued to the dashboard as she gripped her purse. We walked into a sterile lobby that smelled overwhelmingly of bleach and lavender air freshener. Brent marched straight to the reception desk. He pulled out his checkbook and wrote a massive sum for the first month of residency. He slapped the check onto the marble counter alongside a copy of the doctor's fraudulent cognitive assessment. He turned around to face me, dropping all pretense of familial warmth. His voice was cold, authoritative, and stripped of any remaining respect. He declared that this facility was my new home and instructed me to behave myself so I would not be a burden to the staff. Without waiting for a response, he grabbed Aaliyah by the elbow and steered her out the front doors. I stood alone in the lobby as the heavy reinforced glass doors clicked shut and locked mechanically behind them. I was officially a prisoner, but my silence was about to tear their entire world apart. Aaliyah stood by the heavy security doors, staring intently at the scuffed linoleum floor. She refused to meet my gaze, unable to face the man who had given her everything. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest and recited a rehearsed, sterile script about how this confinement was strictly for my own safety. Her voice was completely devoid of any genuine emotion. Brent stepped forward with a triumphant, greedy gleam in his eye. He reached into my coat pocket and confiscated my house keys with a swift, arrogant tug. He did not bother to offer a comforting lie or a fake smile. He simply turned around, gripped my daughter by the arm, and escorted her out of the room. The heavy reinforced door slammed shut, and the magnetic lock engaged with a loud final click. They had abandoned me in a sterile white room that smelled of industrial, antiseptic, bleached linens and boiled cabbage. The The space was devoid of any personal touches, featuring only a narrow, uncomfortable bed, a bolted-down nightstand, and a barred window overlooking a parking lot. I walked over to the mattress and sat down. The cheap springs groaned under my weight. I did not panic. I did not shed a single tear for the daughter who had just traded her father for a quick payday. The time for sorrow had officially passed. I bent down and rolled up the cuff of my trousers. From the hidden lining of my left sock, I pulled out a small prepaid burner phone. I had purchased the untraceable device months ago when I first noticed the glaring discrepancies in Brent's business ledgers. I knew this day would eventually come, and I was entirely prepared for my confinement. I dialed Maxwell's direct line. He picked up immediately, expecting my call. I confirmed my location at the Whispering Pines facility, giving him the exact room number and the specific security wing where I was being held. Maxwell's tone was entirely businesslike, devoid of pity, and focused purely on the tactical counterstrike. He informed me that Brent had wasted zero time. Within an hour of locking me in this room, Brent had officially listed my primary residence on the open real estate market. He listed the property as a cash-only rapid closing sale, pricing it drastically below market value to ensure an immediate transaction. Brent wanted liquid capital, and he wanted it before anyone could ask any inconvenient questions about the legality of the sale. Maxwell asked for the green light to block the listing using my corporate holding company credentials. I told him absolutely not. I ordered Maxwell to step back and let the entire sale proceed without a single legal hurdle. I wanted Brent to sign the closing documents. I needed him to accept the wired funds across state lines. If Maxwell intervened now, Brent would merely face minor civil penalties for attempting a fraudulent transfer. If we allowed the money to move directly into his personal account, Brent would automatically trigger severe federal wire fraud charges. The FBI does not offer lenient plea deals for stealing multi-million-dollar estates from the elderly. I instructed my lawyer to monitor every keystroke of the transaction, document the buyer's information, and prepare the definitive trap for the closing table. I ended the call, wiped the digital footprint, and slipped the burner phone deep beneath the thin mattress. The heavy door clicked open. A young orderly walked in carrying a plastic tray of flavorless pureed food. He wore green scrubs and a laminated name tag that read, Marcus Thorne. He kept his head down, mechanically arranging the plastic cups on the nightstand without making eye contact. I watched the precise, disciplined way he moved, recognizing the relentless work ethic of someone who had fought exceptionally hard for his position. I looked at his last name on the badge. I recognized it immediately. 10 years ago, my corporate holding company established an anonymous scholarship fund designed exclusively for underprivileged youth in the city. I had personally reviewed the applications and selected a bright, desperate teenager who needed full tuition for his advanced nursing degree. I spoke his full name aloud. Marcus froze, dropping a plastic spoon onto the floor. He turned to look at me, total confusion contorting his features. I recited the exact opening lines of the essay he had written a decade ago about his hard-working single mother and his relentless dream of entering the medical field. I identified myself as the sole anonymous benefactor of that educational trust. Marcus stood entirely paralyzed in shock. He realized the seemingly frail man sitting on the narrow bed was the invisible hand that had altered the trajectory of his entire life. I did not ask for his gratitude or his pity. I asked for his immediate tactical assistance. Marcus nodded without a single second of hesitation. He provided me with the administrative Wi-Fi password, the exact rotation schedule of the security staff, and a cloned master key card. In less than 10 minutes, I had regained completely undetected, unrestricted access to the outside world. The very next morning, the magnetic lock on my door disengaged with a sharp, violent snap. Brent barged into my room without knocking. He was not alone. He had brought a jittery, cheap-suited notary public with him to legitimize his theft. Brent marched straight to the edge of the bed and threw a thick, stapled stack of legal documents onto the thin blanket. The papers constituted a comprehensive, irrevocable power of attorney. The finalized document would grant Brent absolute, unchecked authority over every bank account, commercial property, and medical decision in my name. He slapped a heavy ink pen onto the mattress beside my hand. He did not bother maintaining the fake, caring persona he had so carefully utilized in the doctor's office. He crossed his arms and glared down at me with pure malice. He demanded I sign the papers immediately. I looked at the pen and let my hands tremble, feigning utter terror and cognitive confusion. I pulled my knees to my chest and whispered that I did not want to sign away my rights. Brent leaned in close, his face mere inches from mine. His voice dropped to a vicious, venomous whisper that echoed in the sterile room. He threatened that if my signature was not on those pages within 2 minutes, he would immediately cancel the payment for this luxury facility. He stated with brutal clarity that he would have me transferred to a squalid, severely underfunded, state-run ward where patients were routinely strapped to beds, heavily medicated, and forgotten in the dark. He smiled maliciously, fully believing he had backed a helpless, dying old man into an inescapable corner. The ultimate trap was primed. I let my shoulders collapse inward and pulled my knees tighter to my chest. The cheap mattress squeaked under my weight as I shrank away from Brent's looming figure. I turned my eyes toward my daughter, forcing a solitary tear to well up in the corner of my eye. I let my voice crack, pitching it into a pathetic, desperate whimper. I begged Aaliyah to intervene. I reminded her of the scraped knees I bandaged when she was a child, and the late nights I spent reviewing construction blueprints to pay for her college tuition in cash. I asked her if she truly wanted her father to rot in a dark, forgotten state ward. Aaliyah stood entirely rigid by the heavy security door. She crossed her arms and completely averted her gaze, fixing her eyes firmly on the blank white wall to her right. She did not shed a single tear or offer a shred of comfort. She coldly instructed me to stop making this difficult and just sign the papers. The absolute finality in her voice severed the last microscopic thread of my parental mercy. I slowly reached out with a violently trembling right hand. I gripped the heavy ink pen Brent had tossed onto the bed. I pulled the thick stack of legal documents onto my lap. I took a ragged, uneven breath and pressed the pen tip to the signature line. I painstakingly signed my name on every single page, my hand jerking and shaking to reflect total physical defeat. Brent did not even wait for the ink to completely dry. He snatched the thick stack of papers right out of my hands. He threw his head back and laughed openly, a loud barking sound that echoed against the sterile walls. He mocked my perceived weakness, declaring that it was about time the old dog finally learned how to roll over and play dead. Brent shoved the pen back into his pocket, grabbed Aaliyah by the arm, and marched out of the room. The magnetic lock engaged with a heavy metallic clack, sealing me back inside my pristine white cell. The instant their footsteps faded down the corridor, I dropped the terrified act entirely. My posture straightened. The manufactured tremor in my hands vanished without a trace. I pulled the burner phone from beneath my mattress and immediately dialed Maxwell. He answered on the first ring, completely bypassing any standard greeting or polite small talk. I confirmed that Brent had taken the bait and successfully acquired the signed power of attorney documents. Maxwell asked for confirmation on the execution of the signatures. I stated clearly that I had utilized the specific alternate signature variant we established exactly a decade ago. 10 years prior, when I first set up the blind corporate shell company for the lumber empire, Maxwell and I had legally registered a distinct variation of my signature as fundamentally void and indicative of severe coercion. Any legal document bearing that specific loop and slant was automatically nullified under federal law. Brent was currently holding a stack of completely worthless paper. More importantly, Maxwell clarified the lethal nature of our legal trap. Every single time Brent presented that forged document to a financial institution, a real estate broker, or a government agency, he would be actively committing a separate, distinct felony charge of wire fraud and elder abuse. Brent believed he was walking out of the nursing home facility with the absolute keys to my kingdom. In reality, I had just handed him a loaded weapon and carefully guided the barrel directly toward his own chest. The countdown to his absolute legal destruction had officially begun. Brent did not waste a single second exercising his newfound fraudulent authority. Operating under the delusion of absolute control, he aggressively pushed the listing of my primary suburban residence. Within 48 hours, an interested buyer emerged from the digital ether. The buyer was completely anonymous, represented exclusively by a faceless corporate entity promising a rapid cash-only transaction. They submitted an aggressive lowball offer, severely undervaluing the property I had meticulously maintained and updated for 40 years. Brent did not hesitate or attempt to negotiate a higher price. He immediately accepted the heavily discounted cash offer to liquidate the residential asset as quickly as humanly possible. He desperately wanted the liquid funds securely deposited in his personal accounts before anyone could scrutinize the transaction or question my sudden confinement in an assisted living facility. While Brent recklessly rushed the closing paperwork through shady, expedited channels, Aaliyah eagerly prepared to reap the rewards of my perceived demise. Marcus the orderly, acting as my inside man, utilized his administrative access to monitor their digital activity through the facility networks. He brought me printed copies of Aaliyah's recent internet search history. She was sitting in the apartment Brent rented, actively shopping for custom luxury cars online. She was comparing expensive leather interiors and premium sound systems, fully intending to purchase a six-figure vehicle using the very money generated by selling the house her mother died in. She had completely detached herself from any moral consequence or familial loyalty. She viewed my lifetime of sweat equity simply as a winning lottery ticket she had finally cashed in. She was busy customizing the color of her new dashboard while I sat on a narrow, squeaking mattress, calmly letting them construct the very gallows they were about to hang from. The rapid closing date was set for the following Tuesday. Brent successfully finalized the rapid property transfer, legally signing away my home using the voided power of attorney document. He walked directly out of the title office and drove straight to his primary bank branch to secure his stolen wealth. He strode confidently to the teller window, sliding the massive escrow check across the polished counter with a smug, arrogant grin. The teller processed the document without a single question, officially initiating the transfer of hundreds of thousands of dollars into Brent's personal account. The trap sprang shut the exact second the deposit cleared the banking system. Brent turned to walk away from the counter when his phone buzzed violently in his suit pocket. He pulled the device out to review the automated digital receipt generated by the bank clearing system. He expected to see a generic corporate title verifying the source of his newly acquired wealth. Instead, he stared down at this brightly lit screen and froze dead in the middle of the crowded bank lobby. The automated notification clearly stated that the incoming escrow funds originated from a purchasing entity registered under the name Nadine Holdings. The color completely drained from Brent's face as the realization hit him like a physical blow to the stomach. He had just rapidly liquidated the property to a faceless corporation bearing the exact first name of his deceased mother-in-law. The smug arrogance instantly evaporated from his features, replaced by sheer, unadulterated terror. He realized with terrifying certainty that he had not scammed a desperate anonymous buyer looking for a quick real estate flip. He had inadvertently sold my house directly back to my own impenetrable corporate empire. Brent shoved his way through the heavy glass doors of the downtown title office, completely ignoring the receptionist as he marched directly toward the primary escrow officer's desk. He slammed his palms down on the glass surface, demanding an immediate halt to the wire transfer he had authorized just an hour prior. The escrow officer, a stern woman unaccustomed to such outbursts, adjusted her glasses and calmly pulled up the transaction ledger on her monitor. She stated with absolute unwavering professionalism that the funds had already cleared the Federal Reserve Network and the real estate transaction was fully legally binding. Brent slammed his fist against the desk, his voice cracking as he ordered her to reverse the process based on his submitted power of attorney. The officer coldly informed him that the power of attorney had been fully executed and accepted legally, finalizing the sale to the corporate entity listed on the contract. Brent's breathing turned ragged as the walls of his own scam closed in on him. He had bypassed all standard due diligence in his greedy rush for liquid cash. By utilizing the rapid closing loophole, he had bypassed the standard waiting periods that would have normally revealed the buyer's true identity. He had inadvertently yet completely legally sold his father-in-law's primary residence directly to a corporate holding company wholly owned and operated by the very man he was trying to destroy. Nadine Holdings was not a faceless offshore conglomerate. It was the impenetrable corporate shield Germain had built decades ago to protect his assets from men exactly like Brent. The realization that he had trapped himself in an inescapable legally binding contract paralyzed him. The money in his account was now fraudulent proceeds, and he was totally exposed. The heavy mahogany double doors of the title office swung open with a resounding thud that silenced the entire room. Brent spun around, the aggressive demand dying instantly in his throat. Germain stepped across the threshold, radiating an aura of absolute authority. The fragile, terrified old man in the oversized wool coat from the nursing home had completely vanished. In his place stood the architect of a massive corporate empire wearing a flawlessly tailored charcoal suit that commanded immediate respect. He walked with a heavy, deliberate stride, devoid of any manufactured hesitation or physical weakness. Flanking his right side was Maxwell, holding a thick leather briefcase and wearing a distinctly predatory smile. Flanking his left were two stone-faced federal fraud investigators wearing dark windbreakers with golden badges gleaming on their belts. Brent froze, his expensive leather shoes suddenly feeling glued to the carpet. He took a stumbling step backward, bumping into a filing cabinet. Aaliyah, who had been lingering near the waiting area dreaming of her new luxury car, let out a sharp gasp. Her custom designer handbag slipped from her trembling fingers, hitting the floor with a heavy thud, spilling cosmetics and car brochures across the tiles. She stared at her father as if she were looking at a resurrected ghost. Jermaine did not look sick. He did not look confused. He looked absolutely lethal. He stopped directly in the center of the room, his posture rigid and his expression carved from granite. He surveyed the panicked faces of his daughter and his son-in-law, locking eyes with Brent. The shift in power was instantaneous and absolute. The predator had suddenly realized he was standing inside a cage, and the prey held the only key. Jermaine addressed the silent room, his voice echoing with undeniable command. He systematically detailed the exact anatomy of their pathetic conspiracy for everyone to hear. He explicitly outlined how Brent had forged the initial property deeds, paid the moving crew an untraceable cash to empty the house, and actively colluded with a known corrupt neurologist to secure a fraudulent cognitive assessment. The escrow officer gasped, typing furiously on her terminal as the true nature of the transaction unspooled before her. Maxwell stepped forward, opening his leather briefcase to produce the certified corporate bylaws established a decade ago. He handed a single notarized document to the lead federal agent. The agent stepped toward Brent, presenting a federal arrest warrant specifically citing the execution of a legally voided signature to authorize a commercial wire transfer. Brent's face flushed crimson with desperate, unhinged rage. He violently pointed his finger at Jermaine, attempting to leverage his inherent privilege to regain control of the room. He loudly demanded the federal agents arrest the confused, harassing old man who was clearly suffering from a manic episode. He shouted that he was a respected business owner and would have all of their badges for this outrageous insult. The agents remained entirely unmoved by his aggressive posturing. They ignored his frantic demands, stepping smoothly into his personal space. The lead agent forcefully grabbed Brent's wrist, twisting his arm behind his back with practiced efficiency. The sharp, unmistakable sound of steel handcuffs ratcheting closed echoed through the quiet office. Brent struggled against the restraint, shouting obscenities and demanding his legal counsel. He realized his tailored suit and polished vocabulary offered absolutely zero protection against documented federal wire fraud. Humiliated and physically restrained by the federal agents, Brent twisted his head toward the waiting area. He desperately locked eyes with Aaliyah, screaming at her to corroborate his story. He ordered his wife to tell the authorities that her father was violently senile and that everything they did was a joint decision for his own protection. Aaliyah stood paralyzed, her chest heaving as she stared at the handcuffs cutting into her husband's wrists. She hesitated, the reality of federal prison suddenly overshadowing her dreams of limitless luxury. Jermaine did not wait for her to formulate a lie. He reached into Maxwell's open briefcase and pulled out a thick, heavily tabbed manila dossier. He walked toward his daughter and dropped the heavy file directly onto the glass coffee table in front of her. He instructed her to open it. Aaliyah's trembling hands flipped the cover back. Inside were dozens of intercepted financial statements detailing Brent's hidden activities over the past 18 months. The ledgers proved unequivocally that Brent had systematically drained Aaliyah's personal savings accounts, her emergency funds, and her private investments to absolutely zero. He had funneled every single stolen dollar into paying off massive, violently compounding debts accrued through illegal offshore sports betting. He had never intended to share the real estate windfall with her. He needed the money to save his own life from violent creditors. Aaliyah stared at the zero balances, her breathing stopping completely. She looked up at Brent, her expression transforming from terror to absolute disgust. The financial illusion that bound their marriage together shattered instantly into dust. Brent's ultimate betrayal left her completely bankrupt and entirely alone. The agents yanked Brent toward the exit, leaving Aaliyah to face the terrifying, inescapable wrath of the father she had tried to destroy. The federal agents did not grant Brent the luxury of composing himself. They secured the steel cuffs tight against his wrists and hauled him violently toward the heavy double doors of the title office. Brent kicked and thrashed against their grip, his polished veneer completely shattering as he screamed obscenities that echoed off the high glass windows. He demanded they unhand him, threatening endless lawsuits and declaring his innocence to a room full of people who stared back with absolute disgust. The heavy doors swung shut behind them, abruptly cutting off his frantic shouting and leaving a deafening silence in his wake. Aaliyah stood entirely alone in the center of the room. The thick manila dossier exposing her husband's total financial devastation rested heavily on the glass table beside her. She trembled uncontrollably, her designer clothes suddenly looking like ill-fitting armor. She slowly lifted her gaze from the zero-balance bank statements and turned toward me. Her eyes brimmed with desperate, wide-open terror. She took a hesitant step forward, instinctively raising her arms. She fully expected me to step into the role of the protective father, to wrap her in a warm embrace and shield her from the colossal ruin she had just brought upon herself. I did not move a single muscle. My posture remained rigid, my hands resting calmly at my sides. I looked directly into the eyes of the woman I had raised and felt absolutely nothing but the cold, hard resolve of a man protecting his foundation. I spoke with a quiet, lethal clarity that commanded the entire room. I informed her that she currently occupied a house that belonged exclusively to my corporate holding company. I gave her exactly 24 hours to pack her belongings and completely vacate my property. Aaliyah gasped, the color completely draining from her cheeks as the weight of my ultimatum crashed down upon her. Hot, frantic tears finally spilled over her eyelashes, streaming down her face and ruining her carefully applied makeup. She lunged forward, grabbing the sleeve of my charcoal suit, sobbing wildly. She pointed a shaking finger toward the door where Brent had just been dragged away. She loudly blamed her husband for every single transgression, claiming Brent had manipulated her mind and forced her to participate in the hostile takeover. She pleaded that she was just a victim of his aggressive greed and begged me to remember that she was my only child. I firmly reached down and pried her fingers off my jacket. I stepped back, severing the physical connection with absolute finality. I shut her desperate excuses down instantly. I reminded her of the heavy magnetic door clicking shut at the Whispering Pines luxury nursing home. I reminded her of the exact moment she stood in my foyer, fake crying into Brent's shoulder while a crew of strangers hauled her deceased mother's antique curio cabinet out the front door. I told her that Brent may have orchestrated the theft, but she was the one who willingly handed him the keys to the castle. I stated clearly that sharing my bloodline did not excuse her monstrous cruelty, nor did it grant her immunity from the consequences of her own treachery. She had treated me as a disposable resource, and now she was reaping the exact harvest she had sown. I adjusted my suit jacket, turned my back on her weeping figure, and walked out of the title office alongside Maxwell. I left her standing entirely alone amidst the ruins of her shattered, stolen lifestyle. I sat in the passenger seat of Maxwell's car as we drove back to my quiet suburban neighborhood. The sheer exhaustion of the past month began to recede, replaced by a profound, grounding sense of peace. Maxwell pulled up to my curb and I stepped out onto the familiar concrete driveway. The massive diesel moving truck was entirely gone. In its place was an absolute pristine stillness. Maxwell had contacted the moving company's corporate office the very moment I signed the voided power of attorney at the nursing home. He threatened them with a catastrophic civil lawsuit for facilitating the unauthorized liquidation of a multi-million-dollar estate. Terrified of the legal repercussions, the company had scrambled to rectify their colossal mistake. I walked through my front door and breathed in the scent of lemon polish and aged wood. Every single piece of furniture had been meticulously returned to its exact original location. The vintage leather sofa sat perfectly centered in the den. The heavy mahogany dining table rested precisely over the rug. Nadine's glass curio cabinet stood tall in the corner. Every delicate porcelain figure carefully placed exactly where my wife had arranged them decades ago. The physical damage to the hardwood floor remained a permanent scar of their betrayal, but the foundation of my home was secure. I stepped out onto the front porch to take in the evening air. Loretta was standing by the property line holding 2 steaming mugs of dark roast coffee. She walked over and handed me a mug, her eyes shining with quiet, knowing validation. She offered a warm, genuine smile that required absolutely no explanation. Order had been completely restored to my physical space, and the ghosts of my family's greed had been thoroughly exorcised from my sanctuary. The federal investigation into Brent's massive wire fraud escalated with terrifying speed throughout the afternoon. Because Brent had legally merged their finances to secure his offshore betting lines, the federal agents aggressively froze every single bank account tied to his name. Aaliyah discovered the catastrophic reality when she attempted to purchase a luxury hotel room for the night. Her platinum credit cards declined one after another. Her digital banking applications displayed alarming red banners restricting all access to her funds. She had no money to secure lodging, no husband to rely on, and no home to return to after the 24-hour eviction window expired. The extravagant lifestyle she had gleefully built upon my perceived grave evaporated into absolute nothingness. Shortly before midnight, a violent thunderstorm rolled across the city, unleashing torrential sheets of rain against my windows. I sat in my restored living room, sipping a glass of water, listening to the rhythmic drumming of the storm. Suddenly, a frantic, desperate pounding echoed from my front porch. I walked into the foyer and looked through the security camera monitor installed above the door. Aaliyah stood on my welcome mat, completely drenched by the freezing rain. Her expensive designer clothes clung tightly to her shivering frame, and her ruined hair plastered against her pale face. She hammered her fists violently against the heavy oak wood, shouting my name into the howling wind. She demanded I unlock the door and let her inside, screaming that she had absolutely nowhere else to go. She was entirely stripped of her arrogance, reduced to begging for shelter from the very man she had callously locked inside a sterile nursing home cell just days prior. The ultimate consequence of her treacherous entitlement had finally arrived directly at my doorstep. I unlocked the heavy oak door and pulled it open, letting the freezing wind whip through the foyer. Aaliyah stood shivering violently on the welcome mat, completely soaked by the relentless downpour. Her expensive mascara ran down her cheeks in dark, muddy streaks, blending with her desperate tears. She immediately launched into a frantic, high-pitched monologue, aggressively playing the victim card. She wailed about how Brent had deceived her, how she had lost absolutely everything in a matter of hours, and how a father could never leave his only child out in a severe storm. She stepped forward, fully expecting to cross the threshold into the warmth of my home. I planted my feet firmly, completely blocking her entry. I did not offer a comforting smile or a sympathetic gesture. I reached into the interior pocket of my suit jacket and pulled out a folded white envelope. I handed it to her trembling fingers. I explained that the envelope contained a prepaid motel voucher good for exactly 3 nights, alongside a printed list of local employment agencies actively hiring entry-level workers. I looked directly into her shocked, tear-filled eyes and stated that a foundation built on theft collapses in the rain. Before she could formulate another excuse or unleash another manipulative plea, I stepped back inside. I pushed the heavy oak door shut, turning the deadbolt with a loud final click that echoed through the empty foyer. I walked away from the entrance, leaving her to face the absolute reality of her choices. Her frantic pounding resumed a moment later, but I simply walked into my kitchen and poured myself a fresh cup of dark roast coffee, letting the steady drumming of the severe storm drown out her empty, meaningless apologies. Aaliyah sat on the edge of a sagging, lumpy mattress in a cheap, rundown motel located on the dark, industrial outskirts of the city. The small room smelled permanently of stale cigarette smoke and cheap industrial bleach. The pale yellow wallpaper was actively peeling in the corners, revealing damp gray drywall underneath. The relentless rain battered the thin window pane, mirroring the absolute devastation of her current reality. She wrapped her arms tightly around her shivering frame, staring blankly at the flickering neon sign buzzing loudly outside her window. The staggering weight of her sheer arrogance finally crashed down upon her shoulders. For her entire adult life, she had viewed herself as superior, sophisticated, and inherently deserving of limitless luxury. Now, sitting in a damp room she could not even afford herself, she realized her entire extravagant lifestyle had been quietly funded by the very father she deemed entirely worthless. The custom cars, the designer handbags, and the lavish vacations were all purchased with the silent, steady labor of the man she had callously locked inside a sterile nursing home. Brent had simply been a parasitic fraud feeding off my life's work, and she had been his willing, ignorant accomplice. The illusion of her self-made success evaporated instantly. She clutched her expensive leather purse, knowing that every single bank account tied to her name currently displayed a negative balance due to the ongoing federal fraud investigation. She possessed no hidden trust funds and no secret safety nets to catch her brutal fall. She had exactly $0 to her name. As the neon light flickered across her tear-stained face, Aaliyah understood with terrifying clarity that she had to face the impending morning completely destitute, entirely alone, and permanently stripped of all her unearned privilege. The harsh morning light brought no relief, only the brutal necessity of immediate survival. Aaliyah walked into the sterile fluorescent-lit lobby of a local employment agency, clutching the printed list I had handed her the night before. She spent hours filling out tedious application forms, aggressively pushing her prestigious university degree and her fabricated title as Brent's corporate consultant. The reality of the professional world quickly shattered her inflated ego. Hiring managers politely informed her that her elite degree was completely useless without Brent's specific industry connections, which were currently tied up in severe federal indictments. With zero practical work experience and a resume entirely dependent on a disgraced husband, Aaliyah was systematically rejected from every corporate position she applied for. Absolute desperation finally forced her hand. By late afternoon, she accepted a position as a night shift manager at a massive, drafty retail hardware store on the south side of town. The gruff store manager handed her a stiff, scratchy polyester uniform and a cheap laminated name tag. Her first assigned task was to organize the heavy lumber aisle and sweep the concrete floors before the store opened the following day. Aaliyah gripped the wooden handle of the heavy industrial broom, the rough texture actively chafing her perfectly manicured hands. The crushing irony of the situation struck her with the force of a physical blow. She was now wearing a cheap uniform and performing the exact back-breaking manual labor she used to openly mock me for doing. The heavy lumber dust coated her expensive designer shoes as she swept the long aisles, forcing her to swallow her immense pride with every single stroke. The spoiled daughter who had demanded a luxury estate was now sweeping up sawdust just to afford a cheap meal. The shrill ring of her cell phone interrupted the monotonous rhythm of her sweeping. Aaliyah pulled the device from her uniform pocket and stared at the caller identification. The screen indicated an incoming collect call from the county detention center. She accepted the charges with a trembling breath, pressing the phone tightly to her ear. Brent's voice echoed through the receiver, entirely stripped of his usual polished charm. He sounded frantic, cornered, and intensely malicious. He did not ask how she was surviving or apologize for entirely bankrupting her personal accounts. Instead, he immediately demanded that she take off her 3-carat diamond engagement ring and sell it to a local pawn shop first thing in the morning to post his massive bail. Aaliyah hesitated, gripping the broom handle quietly, explaining that the ring was the only valuable asset she had left to survive on. Brent's tone instantly shifted from desperate to venomous. He snarled into the phone, explicitly threatening to completely implicate her in the federal elder abuse conspiracy if she refused to comply. He reminded her that she had been present at the nursing home, that she had verbally coerced me into signing the documents, and that he would happily hand the federal prosecutors enough fabricated evidence to guarantee they shared adjoining prison cells. The harsh fluorescent lights of the hardware store seemed to dim as the absolute terror of her situation paralyzed her. She stood perfectly still in the dusty aisle, the phone feeling like a ticking bomb against her cheek. Aaliyah realized with sickening clarity that she was thoroughly trapped in a lethal vice, caught squarely between the unforgiving wrath of her furious father and the treacherous, vindictive desperation of her criminal husband. The county detention center was a fortress of concrete and reinforced glass, smelling of floor wax and stale sweat. Aaliyah sat rigidly in the sterile visitation room, clutching the heavy black telephone receiver against her ear. On the other side of the smudged plexiglass sat Brent, stripped of his tailored suits and reduced to wearing a faded orange jumpsuit. The physical barrier did absolutely nothing to dampen his vicious arrogance. He leaned forward, his face contorted in an aggressive snarl, and immediately barked orders as if he were still sitting behind a mahogany desk. He did not ask about her living situation or how she was surviving on minimum wage. He simply demanded that she liquidate every remaining asset, specifically commanding her to sell her engagement ring before noon to post his exorbitant bail. He spoke with violent urgency, threatening her with mutual destruction if she failed to follow his explicit instructions. Aaliyah stared at the man she had married. Stripped of his wealth, his status, and his polished charm, Brent was nothing more than a desperate, manipulative parasite. She saw the exact same greedy monster her father had recognized from the very beginning. The grand illusion of their partnership completely dissolved in the harsh fluorescent light of the prison. She did not argue or attempt to explain her dire circumstances. She simply lowered the heavy black receiver, placing it gently back onto its metal cradle. Brent's eyes widened in sudden, absolute panic. He pounded his fists against the thick plexiglass, his mouth opening in a soundless scream of rage. Aaliyah stood up, turned her back on the glass, and walked out of the visitation room with deliberate, measured steps, leaving him entirely trapped in the cage he had built. Aaliyah walked into a dimly lit pawn shop on the commercial edge of the city, the heavy bell above the door announcing her desperate arrival. She approached the scratched glass counter and pulled the massive engagement ring from her coat pocket. She placed the glittering stone on the velvet display mat, pushing it toward the gruff, skeptical appraiser. She declared it was a flawless 3-carat custom diamond and demanded an immediate cash offer to secure a permanent apartment lease. The appraiser did not speak. He picked up the ring with a pair of metal tweezers, screwed a jeweler's loop into his right eye, and examined the stone under a harsh halogen lamp. The assessment took less than 30 seconds. He dropped the ring back onto the velvet mat with a dull, unimpressive clatter. He looked directly at Aaliyah and stated with absolute brutal certainty that the stone was a high-grade cubic zirconia fake set in cheap plated alloy. He informed her that the entire piece of jewelry was worth less than $100. Aaliyah stood frozen, the breath completely knocked from her lungs. She stared down at the worthless piece of metal that had symbolized her elite social status for the past 5 years. Brent had not just drained her bank accounts at the end of their marriage. He had actively deceived her about the fundamental value of their relationship from the very first day. The extravagant narrative of his generational wealth and unlimited success had been a deliberate, calculated lie from the start. Her entire marriage was an absolute financial illusion constructed by a con artist to gain access to her father's genuine empire. She snatched the fake ring off the counter and walked out into the cold street, completely bankrupt in every conceivable way. 2 weeks later, the manager of the hardware store handed Aaliyah a thin paper envelope containing her first honest paycheck. She tore the seal open in the break room, her calloused, unmanicured hands tracing the printed numbers. The net total after taxes was a brutally meager sum that barely covered the security deposit and first month's rent for a cramped, dingy studio apartment on the industrial side of town. That evening, she sat alone on a cheap second-hand mattress placed directly on the scuffed linoleum floor of her new residence. The walls were thin, offering no insulation against the blaring sirens and harsh traffic noises of the avenue outside. She held a plastic bowl of cheap microwavable noodles, the steam rising into the cold, empty air of the unfurnished room. She swallowed a mouthful of the flavorless broth and stared at her bruised hands. Every single muscle in her back and legs ached fiercely from hauling bags of concrete and sweeping endless aisles of sawdust. For the first time in her entire life, Aaliyah deeply understood the immense, crushing weight of a dollar earned through sheer physical exhaustion. She remembered the decades her father had spent covered in commercial lumber dust, working grueling shifts to build the financial empire she had treated as her personal, unlimited playground. She recalled the arrogant disdain she held for manual labor, contrasting it with the agonizing reality of sustaining her own survival without a safety net. The sheer magnitude of her past entitlement washed over her, replacing her usual self-pity with a harsh, sobering dose of reality. The unearned privilege had been thoroughly burned away, leaving behind only the exhausting truth of survival. A sharp, authoritative knock on the thin apartment door shattered the quiet isolation of the room. Aaliyah set her bowl aside and pulled the door open to find a process server standing in the narrow, dimly lit hallway. The man handed her a thick manila envelope, curtly confirming her identity before turning and walking away. Aaliyah carried the heavy package to her mattress and ripped it open. Inside was a formal, undeniable federal subpoena. The United States Attorney's Office officially required her to testify under oath at Brent's impending wire fraud and elder abuse trial. The legal summons laid out the devastating reality of her situation with terrifying clarity. The prosecution needed her inside knowledge of the nursing home conspiracy to definitively secure Brent's conviction. If she took the witness stand and lied to protect her estranged husband, she would be actively committing federal perjury and completely risking a lengthy prison sentence. If she chose to tell the absolute truth, she would have to publicly confess her own active role in the malicious plot to declare her father mentally incompetent and steal his estate. The subpoena forced her to choose a definitive, irreversible path. She was entirely trapped between the righteous, unforgiving wrath of the father she had callously betrayed and the treacherous, vindictive desperation of the criminal husband who had used her as a pawn. The days of hiding behind Brent's manipulation or her father's wealth were officially over. She stared at the federal seal stamped on the document, her heart pounding furiously against her ribs. The trial date was rapidly approaching, and her testimony would permanently dictate the remainder of her life. She had to decide exactly who she was going to be when she finally faced the judge. The federal courthouse smelled heavily of polished, aged wood-stale floor wax and the undeniable weight of impending justice. I sat perfectly upright in the center of the front gallery row wearing an impeccable navy suit that signaled absolute authority and unyielding resolve. I did not fidget or look around the cavernous room. My gaze remained fixed directly on the defense table. Brent sat slumped beside an overworked, heavily sweating public defender. The stark reality of his frozen assets meant he could not afford the high-priced corporate defense attorneys he desperately needed. Brent looked sickly pale, his previously styled hair flat and unkempt, his eyes burning with a furious trapped energy. He violently chewed the inside of his cheek, shooting venomous glares at the prosecution table. The heavy wooden side door adjacent to the gallery creaked open, drawing a collective hush over the room. Aaliyah walked in, accompanied by a court bailiff. The extravagant designer labels and haughty arrogance of her past life had been completely stripped away. She wore a simple, inexpensive beige dress that hung loosely on her thinner frame. Her hands were folded tightly in front of her, the rough calluses from sweeping hardware store floors, now clearly visible under the harsh fluorescent courtroom lights. She kept her chin tucked down deliberately, letting her hair shield her face. She walked directly to the witness waiting area, refusing to make eye contact with the jury, the judge, or the man she had married. She notably refused to look in my direction. The suffocating tension in the room thickened as she took her seat, an isolated pawn caught in a high-stakes game of federal chess. The heavy wooden gavel slammed down against the sounding block, signaling the official commencement of Brent's absolute ruin. The lead federal prosecutor stepped up to the wooden podium, projecting a calm, lethal efficiency. He methodically outlined the staggering scope of the criminal conspiracy for the captivated jury. He detailed the exact timeline of the hostile takeover, breaking down how the defendant actively utilized forged documents to orchestrate a multi-million-dollar theft. He presented the jury with a clear, undeniable narrative of elder abuse. He explicitly described the fabricated medical diagnosis secured through a corrupt, kickback-hungry physician who traded his medical license for a fast payday, and the forced confinement of an entirely competent man inside a restricted nursing facility. The prosecutor pointed directly at Brent, characterizing him as a predatory opportunist who viewed his father-in-law's lifetime of hard work merely as a personal bank account to cover massive illegal gambling debts. When the prosecution concluded, Brent's public defender stood up, audibly clearing his throat as he shuffled a disorganized stack of legal pads. He attempted to paint a vastly different portrait of the events. He desperately tried to characterize me as a deeply confused, spiteful old man, suffering from genuine cognitive decline, who had suddenly changed his mind out of familial malice. He argued that Brent was merely a concerned son-in-law acting proactively to protect a deteriorating patriarch from his own financial mismanagement. The defense attorney claimed the disputed signature was simply the natural byproduct of my failing physical coordination, not a deliberate premeditated trap. From his seat beside me in the front row, Maxwell let out a quiet, knowing scoff. He leaned back against the hard wooden bench and smirked openly at the flailing public defender. Maxwell knew exactly what documentation the prosecution possessed, and he knew the defense's entire argument was about to disintegrate into dust the moment I took the witness stand. The bailiff called my name, and I walked to the witness stand with a steady, commanding stride. I placed my right hand on the Bible, swore the oath, and sat down, adjusting my jacket with meticulous precision. The prosecutor approached and asked me to recount the events leading up to my confinement. I spoke with absolute, unwavering clarity. My voice carried to the back of the courtroom, completely shattering the defense's narrative of a frail, confused victim. I systematically explained the legal trap I had set exactly 10 years prior. I detailed the specific registered variant of my signature that explicitly indicated extreme coercion, rendering any subsequent legal document fundamentally void under federal banking regulations. I explained how I utilized my own anonymous corporate shell company, Nadine Holdings, to legally intercept the fraudulent sale of my primary residence before Brent could abscond with the capital. The jury leaned forward in their uncomfortable wooden seats, completely captivated, hanging on to every single word as they realized they were not watching a victim testify, but a master tactician explaining a flawless checkmate. Brent's public defender practically sprinted to the podium for cross-examination, desperate to rattle my composure. He aggressively badgered me, questioning my memory and accusing me of orchestrating a vindictive setup to frame an innocent man. He raised his voice, demanding to know why a loving father would execute such a cold, calculating scheme against his own family. My composure remained an impenetrable fortress. I did not raise my voice or show a shred of intimidation. I looked directly at the flustered attorney and stated clearly that a man must fortify his estate when he discovers a thief living inside his own walls. The lawyer physically deflated, realizing his aggressive tactics were entirely useless against an adversary who held absolute documented proof of the truth. The prosecutor dismissed me from the stand, and I returned to my seat beside Maxwell, my expression remaining entirely blank. The heavy courtroom doors swung open again as the bailiff escorted Aaliyah into the center of the room. The prosecutor formally called her as the state's primary cooperating witness. As she walked toward the wooden stand, Brent leaned aggressively over the defense table. He locked eyes with his estranged wife, his face twisting into a mask of pure malice. He very deliberately mouthed a silent, violent threat, reminding her of the leverage he held and the consequences of her testimony. Aaliyah's steps faltered for a fraction of a second. She glanced toward the gallery, her terrified eyes searching mine for any sign of paternal reassurance or guidance. I gave her absolutely nothing. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting on my knees, watching her with the cold detachment of a judge observing a stranger. She had to navigate this crucible entirely on her own. Aaliyah took a deep, shuddering breath, placed her calloused hand on the Bible, and swore to tell the whole truth. She sat down, gripping the edges of the wooden enclosure so tightly her knuckles turned white. The federal prosecutor approached the podium, skipping any pleasantries or gentle introductions. He held up the signed nursing home admission forms and the forged moving company contracts. He looked directly at Aaliyah and asked her, under penalty of federal perjury, to state exactly who orchestrated the hostile takeover of the estate, who hired the fraudulent moving trucks, and who authorized the forced confinement of her father. The entire courtroom held its collective breath, waiting in absolute silence to see which definitive path she would finally choose to walk down. Aaliyah gripped the polished wooden edge of the witness stand so tightly, her knuckles turned a stark, translucent white. She slowly turned her head toward the defense table, letting her gaze lock onto Brent for a long, heavy moment. She saw the furious, desperate warning burning in his dark eyes, silently demanding her continued obedience and complicity. She then shifted her gaze to the front row of the gallery, looking directly at me. I sat completely motionless in my tailored navy suit, offering no nod of encouragement and no sign of paternal forgiveness. I simply waited for the unvarnished truth. Aaliyah leaned close to the microphone, her voice starting as a fragile whisper before gaining a hard, undeniable resonance. She admitted to absolutely everything. She detailed exactly how Brent had orchestrated the entire hostile takeover to cover massive, violently compounding debts accrued through illegal offshore gambling syndicates. She openly confessed to her own blind, selfish greed without trying to deflect the blame. She spoke of her toxic obsession with maintaining a fabricated lifestyle of limitless luxury and how she had actively participated in the vile conspiracy to strip her father of his lifelong home. She stared straight at the jury and admitted with brutal, crushing honesty that she and Brent had treated me not as a human being, but as an expired, disposable resource meant entirely for their financial consumption. As her confession echoed through the cavernous courtroom, the polished facade Brent had clung to completely shattered. He erupted from his chair, his face flushed a dark, violent crimson. He screamed a string of vicious obscenities, lunging toward the witness stand with his hands curled into fists. The heavy wooden table crashed forward as two broad-shouldered court bailiffs immediately tackled him. They slammed him back against the defense table, forcibly restraining his thrashing arms while the judge furiously banged his gavel to restore order to the chaotic room. The lead defense attorney approached the podium with a predatory strut, aiming to completely dismantle Aaliyah's credibility before the jury. He aggressively attacked her character, painting her as a vindictive, scorned wife who was simply fabricating a sensational story to steal a lenient federal plea deal. He raised his voice, demanding the jury recognize her as a spoiled, entitled woman throwing her innocent husband under the bus to save her own skin from impending incarceration. Aaliyah did not flinch or shrink back from the blistering verbal assault. The grueling days of sweeping dusty hardware store floors and sleeping on a bare, cold mattress had thoroughly hardened her spirit. She calmly reached into the pocket of her simple beige dress and produced a folded piece of official paperwork. She handed the document to the bailiff to enter directly into the court record. It was the certified appraisal from the downtown pawn shop, legally proving that Brent had deceived her with a worthless cubic zirconia engagement ring from the very beginning of their relationship. The attorney stammered, attempting to pivot his argument, but Aaliyah relentlessly pressed her strategic advantage. She produced printed transcripts of the text messages Brent had sent her directly from the county detention center. She read them aloud, her voice ringing with clear, undeniable authority. The messages explicitly documented Brent aggressively demanding she sell off my antique furniture to post his bail and detailing his specific malicious threats to falsely implicate her in the elder abuse conspiracy if she refused to comply. The stark documented truth hung heavily in the sterile courtroom air. The defense attorney's aggressive posture entirely deflated. He stood frozen at the podium, realizing his fabricated narrative of a loving, concerned son-in-law had just been completely incinerated. The defense collapsed under the crushing, inescapable weight of Aaliyah's documented evidence. The federal jury retired to deliberate, carrying the overwhelming mountain of evidence into the secluded back room. The wait was remarkably brief, reflecting the absolute clarity of the presented facts. In less than 3 hours, the bailiff announced that the jury had reached a unanimous decision. The courtroom fell into an absolute suffocating silence as the foreman stood up to read the finalized verdict. Brent gripped the edge of his table, his breathing shallow and rapid, his knuckles white with impending dread. The foreman spoke with striking clarity, delivering a guilty verdict on every single count leveled against the defense. Brent was officially convicted of federal wire fraud, systemic elder abuse, and criminal conspiracy. The judge wasted zero time in delivering the punitive consequences of his unhinged greed. Citing the exceptionally predatory nature of the crimes against a vulnerable family member, the judge sentenced Brent to 12 consecutive years in a maximum security federal penitentiary completely devoid of any possibility for early parole. 2 federal marshals immediately stepped forward, securing heavy steel shackles around Brent's wrists and ankles. The clinking metal echoed loudly as they hauled him away, dragging him through the side door to begin his decade of absolute, inescapable confinement. Brent did not look back, his arrogant swagger permanently broken. He vanished into the penal system, permanently stripped of his stolen wealth and unearned privilege. Aaliyah slowly stepped down from the polished wooden witness stand. She was legally free, entirely exempt from prosecution due to her comprehensive cooperation and truthful testimony, yet she looked profoundly emotionally devastated. The heavy realization of her destroyed marriage and the ashes of her previous life weighed down every step she took toward the heavy double doors at the back of the room. The judicial ordeal had technically ended, but the absolute reality of her solitary future was just beginning. I walked out through the heavy brass doors of the federal courthouse, stepping beneath the grand stone archway as a cold, relentless rain washed over the gray city streets. Aaliyah was standing alone near the edge of the towering concrete steps, her thin, beige dress offering absolutely zero protection against the biting, aggressive wind. She turned and saw me approaching alongside Maxwell. She took a slow, hesitant step forward, stopping a respectful distance away from us. She did not raise her voice to demand attention, nor did she attempt to ask for a single dollar to ease her absolute poverty. She did not beg to return to the comfort of my home or ask for my immediate, unearned forgiveness. She simply looked me directly in the eyes, her expression stripped of all historical arrogance and pretense, and offered a quiet, genuine apology for everything she had done. Without waiting for a response or lingering for a comforting embrace, she turned her back to me. She pulled her thin collar up against the driving rein and began the long, solitary walk toward the uncovered city bus stop. I stood perfectly still on the dry marble landing, my hands resting calmly in the pockets of my tailored navy suit. I watched the freezing downpour soak her shoulders as she waited on the distant flooded sidewalk. I did not call out to her or offer her a ride in the warm vehicle waiting nearby. I reached into my jacket, pulled out my encrypted mobile phone, and opened a blank message. I typed a single brief sentence instructing Maxwell to immediately initiate the final phase of our strategic blueprint. I pressed send, pocketed the device, and turned back toward the waiting town car. The ultimate foundation had been permanently reset, but the final, most crucial lesson of her grueling education had just officially begun. 6 months slipped by with the quiet, steady rhythm of a pendulum. My restored suburban home became a true sanctuary once again. The deep gouges on the hardwood floors remained as a permanent testament to the betrayal I had survived, but the space above them was filled entirely with peace. I spent my early mornings in the garage, enveloped in the rich scent of sawdust and wood stain, crafting custom mahogany furniture with my own 2 hands. It grounded me, reminding me of the physical labor that built the foundation of my entire life. Loretta remained a constant, comforting presence, frequently walking across the property line with freshly baked goods and 2 steaming mugs of dark roast coffee. We shared quiet conversations on the front porch, enjoying the absolute stillness of a neighborhood completely devoid of parasitic greed. I had fully resumed managing my commercial lumber empire, operating entirely remotely from the polished desk in my den. Nadine Holdings continued to expand its reach, securing massive commercial contracts while remaining completely invisible to the public eye. But my attention was not solely focused on corporate acquisitions. I maintained a steady, silent vigil over my daughter. Maxwell had retained the services of our discreet private investigator, who delivered meticulous weekly reports directly to my desk. I read every single file tracking her every movement, her financial struggles, and her daily routines. I watched from the shadows as she navigated the harsh reality of the world without the safety net of my immense wealth. I did not intervene or offer a single word of encouragement. I simply observed, waiting patiently to see if the grueling crucible of poverty would finally forge the character she had lacked for her entire adult life. Aaliyah's daily existence had been completely stripped of its former glamorous veneer, replaced by a grueling, relentless cycle of physical labor. She worked 2 highly demanding jobs just to keep her head above water. By day, she managed the floor of the drafty retail hardware store, hauling heavy bags of concrete, organizing endless aisles of commercial lumber, and dealing with aggressive contractors. By night, she wore a faded blue uniform and cleaned commercial office buildings downtown, scrubbing floors and emptying trash cans until her muscles screamed in absolute agony. She lived with extreme frugality in her cramped studio apartment, counting every single dollar and budgeting her meager earnings down to the exact penny. Every spare cent she earned was immediately directed toward paying off the heavy legal fees associated with her finalized divorce from Brent. She severed all ties with her criminal ex-husband, legally reverting to her maiden name and completely erasing his toxic presence from her life. Not once in those 6 months did she attempt to contact me. She did not send a desperate text message, leave a weeping voicemail, or show up on my front porch begging for a financial handout. She endured the sheer physical exhaustion and the crushing weight of poverty entirely on her own. She ate cheap microwavable noodles on a mattress placed directly on the linoleum floor, staring at her blistered, calloused hands. The spoiled, entitled woman who had demanded the keys to my castle was completely dead. In her place, a hardened, resilient worker was slowly emerging. She was finally learning the profound value of sweat equity, understanding exactly what it meant to earn her survival through sheer determination and unbreakable grit. The grueling routine of her new life was abruptly interrupted on a cold Tuesday morning. Aaliyah marched into her landlord's dingy leasing office to hand over her monthly rent check, only to be met with a highly confusing statement. The gruff building manager pushed her check back across the counter, bluntly informing her that her rent had already been paid in full for the next 6 consecutive months. He explained that a cashier's check had arrived by certified mail from an entirely anonymous benefactor, covering all her basic housing expenses through the end of the year. Aaliyah stood frozen, staring at the returned check in her calloused hands. Her immediate reaction was not overwhelming relief or joyful gratitude, but a fierce defensive surge of pride. She slammed her hand down on the counter and explicitly demanded to know the exact origin of the funds. The landlord simply shrugged, flatly refusing to provide any further information and stating the transaction was completely untraceable. Aaliyah refused to accept the situation. She practically shoved her own check back into his hands, fiercely insisting that she would continue to pay her own rent with the money she had physically earned. She explicitly ordered the landlord to place the anonymous funds directly into a locked escrow account, outright refusing to touch a single cent of unearned charity. She walked out of the leasing office with her head held high, leaving the manager staring after her in absolute bewilderment. When Maxwell delivered the investigator's report detailing this specific interaction, a rare, genuine smile touched the corners of my mouth. The intense heat of her struggle was effectively burning away her arrogance, proving she was finally learning to stand entirely on her own 2 feet. Just as Aaliyah began to find a steady rhythm in her grueling new reality, the ground shifted violently beneath her feet once again. The independent hardware store she had managed for the past 6 months was suddenly bought out by a massive, aggressive corporate entity. The sweeping acquisition brought immediate rumors of severe budget cuts, sweeping layoffs, and total staff replacements. A formal notice was pinned to the breakroom bulletin board announcing that the new executive management team had scheduled a comprehensive, unannounced site inspection for the upcoming week. Aaliyah doubled down on her efforts, working extensive overtime hours off the clock to ensure the massive retail space was absolutely immaculate. She meticulously organized the inventory, scrubbed the heavy concrete aisles until they gleamed, and prepared exhaustive operational reports to aggressively defend her managerial position. She knew her meager livelihood entirely depended on keeping this specific job, and she was fiercely prepared to fight for her continued employment. On the morning of the dreaded inspection, Aaliyah stood near the front entrance wearing a perfectly pressed uniform and her cheap laminated name tag. Her heart hammered against her ribs as a sleek, heavily tinted black SUV slowly pulled into the store's main parking lot. The expensive vehicle parked directly in front of the main glass doors dominating the designated executive space. Aaliyah squared her shoulders, taking a deep, fortifying breath as the heavy driver's side door swung open. A pair of polished leather dress shoes stepped out onto the damp asphalt, signaling the definitive arrival of the new corporate owner. The polished leather dress shoes planted firmly on the damp asphalt belonged to me. I stepped out of the sleek black SUV into the crisp morning air, wearing a tailored charcoal suit that immediately commanded the attention of the entire retail staff. Aaliyah stood frozen behind the main customer service counter, her hands gripping the edge of the laminate surface as her eyes widened in absolute shock. I did not offer a warm smile of greeting or acknowledge our shared bloodline. I walked past the register with a cold, terrifying authority, stepping directly into my role as the majority shareholder of the newly acquired corporate entity. I proceeded to walk the long, heavily stocked aisles of the hardware store, running my fingers over the commercial shelving and meticulously inspecting the organized inventory. Aaliyah trailed a few steps behind me in her faded work apron, her posture rigid with intense nervous energy. I treated her exactly like any other entry-level employee facing a strict corporate audit. I pointed out minor dust accumulations near the heavy machinery displays and questioned the structural integrity of the seasonal end caps. The professional boundary I established was absolute and deeply intimidating. I did not allow a single ounce of paternal warmth to bleed into my voice as I barked sharp, rapid-fire questions regarding daily foot traffic and local contractor accounts. She answered each inquiry with a steady, breathless precision, refusing to let her underlying panic break her professional facade. I demanded to see the comprehensive operational reports she had prepared, striding purposefully toward the back of the building. I left her scrambling to keep pace with my relentless, demanding stride, forcing her to prove her exact worth on my strictly defined corporate battlefield. I signaled for her to follow me into the cramped, windowless back office, illuminated only by a harsh overhead fluorescent bulb. I sat down behind the battered metal desk, flipped open the heavy financial ledgers, and began a ruthless dissection of the store's monthly operating budget. I deliberately targeted her most recent management decisions, sharply criticizing a massive overstock of seasonal lumber and questioning the inflated labor hours approved during the previous holiday weekend. I leaned back in the creaking office chair, challenging her basic competency and waiting for the inevitable emotional collapse I had witnessed countless times before. Aaliyah did not cower. She did not shed a single tear or offer a pathetic, victimized excuse. Instead, she stepped forward, placed her calloused hands flat on the metal desk, and defended her work with an arsenal of hard, undeniable facts. She cited the exact profit margins of the seasonal lumber, pulling up digital supply chain data to prove she had secured the materials at a steep discount just days before a major regional shortage. She justified the overtime labor by presenting the corresponding spike in commercial contractor sales, proving her scheduling decision had ultimately yielded a 20% increase in net revenue. She spoke with a fierce, grounded confidence, her voice ringing with the undeniable authority of someone who had learned the business through grueling physical exhaustion. She countered my every corporate critique with precise, localized data, entirely dismantling my intentional traps. She successfully proved that she understood the raw mechanics of the hardware business from the absolute ground up. The spoiled, entitled heiress was completely gone, replaced by a battle-tested manager who fiercely protected the profits she had actively bled to generate. I closed the heavy leather-bound ledger with a sharp, definitive snap that echoed loudly in the small office. The grueling audit was officially complete. I reached inside my suit jacket, retrieved a pristine corporate contract, and slid it across the scratched metal desk toward her. I looked directly into her eyes and offered her an immediate promotion to regional director of the entire newly acquired hardware division. The printed document guaranteed a substantial six-figure salary, comprehensive executive benefits, and total operational control over a dozen retail locations. It was a golden ticket out of her cramped studio apartment and back into a life of comfortable financial security. Aaliyah stared down at the lucrative contract for a long, silent moment. She slowly reached out, but instead of signing her name, she firmly pushed the document back across the desk. She looked me squarely in the eye and flatly declined the offer. She stated with absolute clarity that she intended to earn her professional elevation based entirely on her own demonstrated merit, not through the unearned nepotism of a wealthy father. She demanded to remain in her current position at this specific store until she definitively hit her projected quarterly sales targets, explicitly refusing to accept a leadership role she had not physically bled to secure. She wanted the undeniable satisfaction of proving her independent worth to the corporate board entirely separate from our complicated familial history. I did not argue or attempt to persuade her otherwise. I simply picked up the unexecuted contract, slid it back into my interior pocket, and offered her a single profound nod of genuine approval. The grueling lesson had finally taken root. The quiet, steady triumph of her professional validation was violently disrupted later that exact same week. Aaliyah returned to her drafty studio apartment after a grueling 14-hour shift to find a thick, heavily stamped envelope shoved into her rusted mailbox. The official return address bore the unmistakable seal of the maximum security federal penitentiary, where Brent was currently serving his 12-year sentence. Her stomach plummeted as she tore the heavy paper open, her calloused fingers trembling against the crisp legal documents inside. The drafted letter was a vicious, calculated strike from behind iron bars. Brent had utilized a desperate prison paralegal to thoroughly comb through their finalized divorce filings, actively hunting for a single vulnerability. The letter explicitly claimed a deliberate critical technicality in the original dissolution paperwork, arguing that the divorce had been filed improperly and was therefore legally invalid. Because they were technically still bound by marriage in the eyes of the state, Brent was now aggressively demanding a significant portion of her new managerial salary as mandated spousal support. He threatened to drag her back into a prolonged, bankrupting legal battle, promising to drain every single honest dollar she managed to earn by sweeping floors and hauling lumber. He intended to siphon her hard-earned wages directly into his prison commissary account, acting as an invisible parasite. The toxic ghost of her past was actively attempting to drag her back down into the crushing depths of absolute financial ruin. Aaliyah stared at the menacing legal threat, the sheer injustice of the demand igniting a fresh, violent fury in her chest. She realized with terrifying certainty that severing ties with a malignant fraud required much more than just a judge's signature. Aaliyah navigated her rusted commuter car through the desolate gray landscape surrounding the maximum security federal penitentiary, her mind remarkably clear of the paralyzing anxiety that used to govern her every decision. She parked in the cracked asphalt lot and walked through the heavy steel security doors, enduring the invasive metal detectors without a single tremor in her hands. She sat perfectly still in the sterile, windowless visitation booth, staring through the thick, smudged plexiglass at the man who had actively orchestrated her complete financial and emotional ruin. Brent entered the room flanked by two heavily armed guards. He looked incredibly haggard, his face pale and sunken from months of harsh prison food and restricted sunlight, yet his underlying aggressive arrogance remained entirely intact. He snatched up the heavy black receiver and immediately launched into a vicious, demanding tirade. He completely ignored her new, hardened demeanor and aggressively ordered her to deposit a massive percentage of her newly acquired corporate salary into his commissary account by the end of the week. He leaned his face violently against the reinforced glass, spitting venomous threats about contacting sleazy tabloid journalists and hungry media outlets. He explicitly promised to grant exclusive fabricated interviews detailing her active participation in the elder abuse conspiracy, vowing to publicly drag her name through the mud until her new corporate bosses fired her out of sheer embarrassment. Aaliyah listened to his desperate, threatening monologue in absolute, unbroken silence. She did not lower her gaze, shed a single tear, or display a fraction of the terrified obedience he clearly expected. She stared back at him with a cold, impenetrable calm, viewing the screaming man not as a dangerous threat, but as a pathetic, caged animal completely incapable of harming her ever again. Aaliyah reached into her worn canvas tote bag and produced a thick, neatly bound stack of official legal documents. She calmly slid the heavy paperwork through the narrow metal transfer slot located at the bottom of the security partition. Brent snatched the papers aggressively, fully expecting a panicked financial settlement offer or a desperate plea for a truce. Instead, his bloodshot eyes scanned the cover page of a finalized, totally airtight federal divorce decree. Aaliyah spoke directly into the receiver with a steady, lethal clarity, informing him that the document had already been signed, sealed, and officially entered into the permanent court record by a federal judge. She explicitly explained that Maxwell had personally handled every single detail of the complex litigation entirely pro bono, specifically designing the settlement to serve as an impenetrable legal shield against any future extortion. The decree included a severe, federally mandated protective order tailored to completely neutralize his malicious behavior. She watched the remaining color completely drain from Brent's sunken cheeks as she outlined the specific non-negotiable stipulations. She clearly stated that any further attempt to contact her, extort money, or initiate tabloid smear campaigns would instantly trigger a direct violation of the federal mandate. The immediate consequence would be a guaranteed transfer into permanent 23-hour solitary confinement alongside brand new felony extortion charges added directly to his current 12-year sentence. Brent's mouth opened and closed in absolute stunned silence as the terrifying reality of his permanent subjugation set in. His fabricated technicality regarding their previous divorce filings had been completely eradicated by Maxwell's brilliant legal maneuvering. His final desperate attempt at maintaining leverage was utterly annihilated, leaving him permanently legally severed from her life and entirely powerless to execute his vindictive threats. Aaliyah placed the heavy black receiver gently back onto its metal cradle, permanently cutting off the sound of Brent's frantic, muffled shouting through the thick safety glass. She turned her back on him for the absolute final time and walked out of the bleak visitation room with her shoulders squared and her head held high. She pushed open the heavy steel doors of the penitentiary and stepped out into the blinding, brilliant sunlight of the crisp afternoon. The oppressive, suffocating weight that had been crushing her chest for the past 6 agonizing months instantly evaporated into the fresh air. She stood in the concrete parking lot, pulled out her cheap prepaid cell phone, and permanently blocked the prison's incoming caller identification numbers, executing a clean, irreversible break from the toxic ruin of her past. She climbed into her battered car and drove the long highway back to her cramped studio apartment on the industrial side of the city. As she walked through the thin wooden door of her modest home, she did not feel the usual sting of humiliation or the bitter resentment of lost luxury. Instead, an overwhelming, profound sense of deep personal liberation washed over her completely. She looked down at her calloused hands and the cheap second-hand mattress resting on the scuffed linoleum floor. She had been brutally thrown into the absolute fire of complete destitution and had emerged entirely forged in unbreakable steel. She realized with stunning clarity that she no longer feared poverty, grueling manual labor, or the permanent loss of unearned privilege simply because she now possessed the undeniable, hard-earned proof that she could survive it all entirely on her own. The quiet, grounding peace of her newly established independence was abruptly interrupted the following morning by a crisp, formal summons delivered directly to her email inbox. The message contained no polite pleasantries and no emotional overtures. Only a strict, undeniable directive from my central holding company requiring her immediate presence at my private residence. Aaliyah drove back to the familiar, impeccably manicured suburban neighborhood, pulling her rusted commuter car slowly onto my pristine concrete driveway. She stepped out onto the pavement and looked up at the massive, beautifully restored home. It was the exact same property she had brazenly attempted to liquidate during her treacherous alliance with Brent, and this was the very first time she had been allowed to return since the agonizing night I forced her out into the freezing rain. She walked slowly up the paved brick walkway, acutely aware of the deep, permanent physical scars still etched into the hardwood floors just beyond the front threshold. She stepped up onto the sweeping front porch and stood completely still, staring intently at the heavy brass door knocker, polished to a brilliant shine. Her heart hammered a frantic, unsteady rhythm against her ribs as the immense gravity of the summons settled heavily over her shoulders. She had proven her undeniable resilience in the demanding corporate sector and completely eradicated the criminal parasite from her personal life, but facing the absolute, unyielding judgment of the man whose heart she had callously broken was an entirely different trial. She raised her trembling, calloused hand toward the cold brass fixture, completely unsure of what specific final judgment or ultimate consequence awaited her on the other side of the heavy oak door. Aaliyah lifted her hand, feeling the rough calluses on her palm brush against the cold metal. She gripped the heavy brass door knocker and brought it down twice against the solid oak. The sound echoed with a profound finality, marking the absolute end of her prolonged exile. A moment later, the deadbolt clicked and the heavy door swung inward. I stood in the entryway wearing a simple button-down shirt and dark trousers, my posture relaxed but completely commanding. I did not offer a wide smile or a dramatic display of emotion, but I stepped aside and calmly invited her inside. Aaliyah crossed the threshold, her worn boots stepping carefully onto the polished hardwood floors. The familiar, comforting scent of fresh lemon polish and dark roasted coffee instantly enveloped her, a stark contrast to the sterile, chemical smell of the commercial offices she cleaned every night. I led her into the den, gesturing toward the vintage leather sofa resting perfectly in the center of the room. She sat down on the very edge of the cushions, keeping her back straight and her hands folded neatly in her lap. I took my seat in the heavy mahogany armchair directly opposite her. The oppressive, volatile energy that used to define our interactions was entirely gone. The power dynamic in the room had fundamentally shifted. We were no longer a desperate, entitled child demanding unearned privileges and a frustrated father attempting to enforce boundaries. We were simply two adults sitting in a quiet, grounded space defined entirely by hard, undeniable truths. The silence between us was not tense or hostile, but deeply reflective, acknowledging the immense destruction we had both survived to reach this exact moment. I broke the quiet stillness of the room, speaking with a steady, measured cadence. I looked directly into her eyes and openly acknowledged my own undeniable role in cultivating her disastrous sense of entitlement. I admitted that after Nadine passed away, I had been completely consumed by a profound, suffocating grief. In my desperate attempt to shield my only child from that agonizing pain, I had made the catastrophic mistake of confusing financial generosity with genuine paternal love. I confessed that I had actively spoiled her, shielding her from the harsh consequences of reality, and accidentally creating a child who fundamentally valued superficial price tags over absolute, unyielding principles. I laid my historical failures bare, offering no excuses for the environment that allowed her profound arrogance to take root. Aaliyah listened intently, absorbing every single word without shrinking away or attempting to deflect the blame. She did not interrupt to defend her past behavior or shift the responsibility onto my shoulders. When I finished speaking, she took a deep, fortifying breath and took complete, absolute responsibility for her own monstrous actions. She stated clearly that my financial indulgence did not excuse her willingness to conspire with Brent. She admitted that her own unchecked greed and desperate desire for elite social status had blinded her to the basic humanity of the father who had provided for her. She fully owned her treacherous role in attempting to declare me mentally incompetent, refusing to hide behind Brent's manipulation any longer. Her confession was raw, articulate, and completely devoid of the victim mentality she had clung to for her entire adult life. I stood up from the mahogany armchair and walked over to the small wooden credenza in the corner of the den. I poured 2 cups of hot dark tea from a ceramic pot, handing one directly to Aaliyah before taking my seat again. As the steam curled into the quiet room, I began to tell her the unvarnished truth about my early days in the commercial lumber industry. I described the grueling reality of my youth, explaining exactly how I had spent 5 agonizing years sweeping thick layers of sawdust from the concrete floors of a shop owned by a deeply racist, aggressively abusive man. I detailed the relentless physical exhaustion, the daily indignities, and the absolute necessity of swallowing my pride to meticulously learn the complex mechanics of the trade from the inside out. I told her that I endured that brutal environment not out of submission, but out of a calculated, fierce determination to build an independent foundation. I looked at her calloused hands holding the warm teacup and explained that genuine lasting wealth has absolutely nothing to do with luxury cars or designer labels. I stated clearly that true wealth is simply the absolute ability to walk away from a bad deal without a single ounce of fear. It is the unshakable confidence that you can survive any financial ruin because you possess the raw physical capability to rebuild from the ground up. Aaliyah sat perfectly still, absorbing the profound weight of the lesson. The grueling months she had spent scrubbing commercial office floors and hauling heavy concrete had perfectly primed her to finally understand the undeniable truth behind my words. I reached into my pocket and retrieved a small, heavy object. I leaned forward and placed a single tarnished brass key onto the glass coffee table resting between us. I watched Aaliyah's eyes drop to the metal, her expression reflecting a cautious, highly guarded curiosity. I explained with absolute unwavering authority that the key unlocked a highly secure private offshore storage unit. I revealed that this specific vault contained the finalized corporate documents, operational blueprints, and total financial ledgers for the entirety of Nadine Holdings and my commercial lumber empire. I stated clearly that a massive expanding corporate entity inherently requires a competent, fiercely dedicated successor to ensure its permanent survival. However, I explicitly warned her that inheriting this massive financial infrastructure was no longer a guaranteed birthright. I told her that the definitive successor must actively prove they can handle the crushing, immense weight of this corporate crown without fracturing the moral and operational foundation it was meticulously built upon. I pushed the brass key slightly closer to her side of the glass table, issuing a profound, non-negotiable challenge. She would not be handed a functioning empire to blindly consume. She would be required to analyze the ledgers, understand the grueling logistics, and actively demonstrate the exact same resilience that had kept the company alive through decades of aggressive corporate warfare. Aaliyah stared down at the key, her pulse quickening as she realized the true magnitude of my ultimate test. The absolute final phase of her rigorous education demanded that she prove her worth on the highest possible corporate stage. Aaliyah accepted the brass key with a steady hand, fully understanding the brutal weight of the challenge I had laid before her. The very next morning, long before the sun even considered cresting the horizon, she arrived at the main distribution hub of Nadine Holdings. The digital clock on the brick wall glared a harsh red 5 in the morning as she stepped onto the frosted concrete. She traded her cheap retail uniform for thick denim work pants, a heavy canvas jacket, and reinforced steel-toed boots. I stood waiting for her near the massive loading bays alongside the veteran yard foreman, a grizzled man who suffered zero fools and harbored a deep disdain for corporate executives. I did not introduce her as my only daughter or the future heir to a massive commercial lumber empire. I presented her simply as a brand new entry-level logistics trainee who was expected to pull her own weight or face immediate termination. The professional boundary was absolute. For the next 3 consecutive months, Aaliyah plunged into an agonizing daily gauntlet of grueling physical and mental labor. She spent her days physically loading massive pallets of raw timber onto flatbed trucks under the blistering afternoon sun. She spent her evenings meticulously calculating vast, complex inventories in a drafty warehouse office, hunting down supply discrepancies with relentless precision. She routinely faced aggressive, demanding commercial contractors who aggressively tested her authority, attempting to bully the new trainee into expediting their orders. Aaliyah never once backed down. She met their hostility with cold, unwavering facts and a spine forged of absolute iron. She earned the deep, permanent calluses on her hands, proving her worth in a relentless environment that fundamentally despised unearned privilege and demanded total operational excellence. The true measure of her transformation was abruptly tested when a catastrophic supply chain disruption hit the region entirely without warning. A severe unseasonal freeze paralyzed the primary transport routes, completely halting a massive shipment of specialized structural timber. This exact shipment was the keystone of a multi-million-dollar commercial development contract that Nadine Holdings had recently secured. The failure to deliver the materials on time would trigger devastating financial penalty clauses and permanently damage the company reputation. The senior yard managers immediately fell into a chaotic panic, frantically pacing the warehouse floor and loudly preparing pathetic excuses to present to the angry developers. Aaliyah did not panic or join the chorus of defeat. She stepped forward and immediately seized control of the chaotic room. Drawing directly upon the gritty, localized logistical skills she had developed while managing the retail hardware store, she completely bypassed the paralyzed primary transit routes. She spent 6 straight hours on the phone aggressively negotiating with a network of secondary independent suppliers she had personally cultivated relationships with over the past 3 months. She meticulously rerouted dozens of smaller shipments through clear back roads, coordinating a highly complex web of independent freight drivers to transport the timber piece by piece. She aggressively demanded favorable terms, leveraging immediate cash payouts to secure the fastest possible transport. Against all statistical odds, she managed to assemble and deliver the entire structural timber order a full 12 hours before the final contractual deadline. She single-handedly saved the multi-million-dollar deal. When she finally walked out of the dispatch office, the senior managers and the grizzled yard workers fell completely silent. Their initial skepticism completely vanished entirely, replaced by a profound, undeniable respect for a woman who had just proved she could navigate absolute disaster. I watched the entire crisis unfold from the secluded vantage point of the glass-enclosed catwalk office, suspended high above the sprawling lumber yard. I stood perfectly still, my hands resting in the pockets of my tailored suit, observing my daughter command the warehouse floor with striking efficiency. I saw her handle intense logistical disputes between stressed freight drivers and exhausted yard workers with a brilliant mixture of fairness and unyielding authority. She completely de-escalated explosive arguments without ever raising her voice or resorting to the toxic arrogance that had once defined her entire personality. She never once weaponized her surname or demanded compliance through fear. Instead, she led by undeniable example, stepping directly onto the loading dock to physically help secure the final timber pallets when the crew fell behind schedule. She was covered in a thick layer of sawdust and engine grease, looking completely exhausted but radiating a quiet, magnificent strength. As I watched her shake hands with the veteran foreman, a profound wave of emotion tightened my chest. I realized with absolute certainty that the ruthless, agonizing lesson I had forced her to endure had literally saved her soul. By completely cutting off her unearned financial supply and casting her out into the freezing reality of poverty, I had forced her to shed her destructive vanity. The parasitic entitlement that had nearly destroyed our family was completely eradicated, burned to ash by the relentless heat of honest labor. She was no longer a fragile, spoiled child demanding a fabricated royal lifestyle. She was a brilliant, hardened leader who fundamentally understood the true cost of success. The foundation of her character had been permanently reset, and she was finally ready to inherit the immense legacy I had built. The hard-earned stability of her newly established authority was abruptly threatened by an unexpected and massive external attack. A highly aggressive multinational corporate conglomerate launched a sudden, vicious, hostile buyout attempt targeting the entirety of Nadine Holdings. The predatory rival corporation completely bypassed standard negotiation channels, directly presenting our board of directors with an astronomical multi-billion-dollar cash offer designed to overwhelm their financial senses. The faceless investors aimed to swallow my lumber empire whole, intending to strip the company for its assets and permanently erase the legacy I had built from the ground up. The board members were immediately blinded by the sheer magnitude of the proposed payout, their loyalty wavering under the intense pressure of unimaginable personal wealth. I knew my own aggressive refusal would not be enough to secure the vital votes needed to block the catastrophic sale. I made a definitive, calculated decision to completely step back from the podium. I summoned Aaliyah into the executive boardroom, informing her that she must stand alone before the ruthless panel of directors and formally present our corporate counter-strategy. I explicitly told her that the ultimate fate of the entire empire now rested entirely in her calloused hands. She had to passionately defend the operational integrity of the company, utilizing every piece of logistical knowledge and financial grit she had acquired in the yard to prove that Nadine Holdings was worth far more alive than dead. If she failed to convince the terrified board members to reject the buyout, the empire would be instantly devoured by the predatory conglomerate. The ultimate test of her succession had arrived, and there was absolutely no room for a single misstep on this unforgiving corporate battlefield. The heavy glass doors of the executive boardroom glided shut, sealing off the sprawling commercial lumberyard below and plunging the space into absolute, highly pressurized silence. 3 rival executives sat along the polished mahogany table, their tailored postures radiating an aggressive, entirely unearned arrogance. They were the aggressive vanguard of the multinational conglomerate attempting the hostile takeover, and they clearly believed they had already won the war. The lead executive leaned forward, steepling his manicured fingers, and delivered a highly condescending presentation. He projected a series of manipulated market forecasts onto the digital screen, heavily implying that Nadine Holdings was an archaic, localized dinosaur, completely incapable of surviving the brutal realities of the modern global market without their corporate backing. He spoke of immediate liquidation restructuring and a massive cash buyout designed to blind the current leadership with instant, unearned wealth. He presented the astronomical offer as an act of absolute corporate mercy. Throughout this blistering, patronizing speech, I sat perfectly motionless at the head of the long table. My hands rested calmly on the polished wood, my expression entirely unreadable. I did not interrupt their rehearsed pitch, nor did I offer a single word to defend the empire I had literally bled to build. Instead, when the lead executive finally slid the binding contract across the table and demanded an immediate signature, I simply leaned back in my leather chair. I shifted my gaze entirely to my daughter, extending a single open hand in her direction. I completely deferred my absolute authority to her, silently demanding that she step directly into the line of fire and prove her right to hold the crown. The executives scoffed, turning their dismissive glares toward Aaliyah, fully expecting the inexperienced daughter to completely crumble under their immense corporate pressure. Aaliyah did not flinch under their combined predatory scrutiny. She stood up slowly, her movements completely devoid of the frantic, nervous energy that had once defined her entire existence. She smoothed the front of her simple blazer, reached out, and deliberately pushed their multi-billion-dollar buyout contract back across the center of the table. Her voice cut through the sterile boardroom air with lethal, undeniable clarity as she flatly and absolutely rejected their astronomical offer. She did not raise her voice or allow a single ounce of defensive emotion to bleed into her tone. Instead, she activated her own digital presentation, completely incinerating their fabricated market forecasts with an arsenal of impenetrable hard-earned data. Drawing directly from her grueling months of physical labor and logistical management on the yard floor, she outlined a comprehensive 10-year strategic expansion plan for Nadine Holdings. She detailed a revolutionary shift toward exclusive, sustainable sourcing and a highly aggressive direct-to-consumer sales pipeline that completely bypassed traditional expensive commercial middlemen. She methodically dismantled their financial assessment line by line, utilizing precise, localized profit margins to prove their astronomical offer actually severely undervalued our tangible assets by hundreds of millions of dollars. She exposed their hostile buyout not as a corporate rescue mission, but as a desperate, transparent attempt to steal a vastly superior logistics network for pennies on the dollar. Her presentation was a flawless, cold-blooded execution of corporate warfare stripped entirely of vanity and rooted purely in sweat equity. The three rival executives sat frozen in their plush leather chairs, their condescending smirks completely wiped from their pale faces as they realized they had just been intellectually slaughtered by a woman they had entirely dismissed as a weak, nepotistic placeholder. The lead executive stammered frantically, attempting to salvage his completely shattered presentation, but Aaliyah refused to grant him a single inch of breathing room. She stepped out from behind her chair, walked directly to the edge of the mahogany table, and pointed a steady, calloused finger straight toward the heavy glass exit doors. She locked eyes with the thoroughly humiliated men and delivered her final, devastating verdict. She stated with absolute, unyielding authority that the structural foundation of Nadine Holdings had been forged through decades of actual blood-agonizing physical exhaustion and unshakable moral principles. She explicitly informed them that this immense breathing legacy was absolutely not for sale to a group of men in cheap, mass-produced suits looking for a quick, parasitic financial flip. Her words hit the executives like a physical blow, entirely stripping away their fabricated corporate armor. They looked frantically toward the head of the table, desperately hoping I would intervene to salvage their lucrative acquisition. I did not offer them a lifeline. Instead, a slow, profound smirk spread across my face as I watched my daughter ruthlessly protect the empire. The absolute realization of their total defeat crashed over the rival team. Stripped of their leverage and thoroughly intellectually humiliated, the three men scrambled to pack their slick leather briefcases in absolute suffocating silence. They practically sprinted toward the glass doors, fleeing the boardroom with their heads bowed in total disgrace. Aaliyah stood perfectly still, watching the elevator doors slide shut and permanently sever the hostile threat. She had faced the ultimate corporate crucible entirely on her own, successfully defending the fortress and proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that she had completely earned the absolute right to inherit my kingdom. The heavy adrenaline of the brutal corporate victory hung thickly in the sterile boardroom air for a long, triumphant moment. Aaliyah turned toward me, a rare, genuine smile of shared accomplishment finally breaking through her hardened professional facade. I stood up from my executive chair to formally acknowledge her brilliant tactical execution, intending to officially hand over the total operational reins of the company. However, before the words could leave my mouth, a sudden blinding agony exploded directly behind my sternum. The intense pressure crushed my lungs like a steel vise, instantly driving the oxygen from my chest. My vision violently blurred into a hazy gray tunnel, and my legs buckled completely beneath me. The terrifying heart condition I had highly strategically faked at the central bank months prior to test the loyalty of my inner circle had suddenly violently manifested into a terrifying biological reality. I collapsed heavily against the edge of the polished mahogany table, sending a tray of crystal water glasses shattering violently across the hardwood floor. I crashed downward, clutching my chest as the agonizing pain paralyzed my entire body. Aaliyah's triumphant smile instantly vanished, entirely replaced by absolute visceral terror. She abandoned all remnants of her stoic corporate discipline, dropping to her knees beside me on the floor, covered in broken glass. She grabbed my shoulders, her hands trembling violently as she screamed my name, begging me to stay conscious. Her voice echoed off the soundproof glass walls, transforming into a desperate, frantic shriek for someone to immediately call an ambulance. The absolute foundation of her new life had just been perfectly secured, but the man who had brutally forged her survival might not live to witness her reign. The sharp, rhythmic beeping of the cardiac monitor pierced the absolute silence of the sterile intensive care unit. Aaliyah sat rigidly in the stiff plastic chair beside the elevated hospital bed, her calloused fingers wrapped tightly around my unmoving hand. The brilliant fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across the room, illuminating the chaotic tangle of transparent tubes and intravenous lines, securing my fragile life. An exhausted cardiovascular surgeon stood at the foot of the bed, his expression grim as he delivered the terrifying prognosis. He stated with absolute clinical detachment that the massive arterial blockage required immediate high-risk quadruple bypass surgery to ensure my survival. The cruel, inescapable irony of the situation hung heavily in the sterilized air. Months prior, I had strategically fabricated a severe cardiac episode within the polished walls of the central bank to ruthlessly test the loyalty of my inner circle, intentionally initiating her grueling exile. Now the fabricated scenario had violently materialized into a genuine life-threatening crisis. I lay completely incapacitated, stripped of my tailored suits and intimidating corporate authority, entirely dependent on the steady hum of medical machinery and the quick decisions of surgical strangers. Aaliyah did not collapse into a puddle of weeping panic or scream helplessly at the medical staff. She did not seek comfort or validation. She simply nodded at the surgeon, her jaw clenched tight with iron resolve as she authorized the life-saving procedure without a single second of hesitation. The ultimate architect of her destruction and subsequent rebirth was now fighting a desperate, agonizing battle against his own failing biology, while she stood in unwavering guard at the sterile threshold of the operating theater. As the heavy surgical doors swung shut behind my stretcher, a profound and absolute role reversal immediately commenced. Aaliyah marched directly into the crowded waiting room and transformed a small, cramped corner table into a fortified corporate command center. She opened her battered laptop and immediately seized total operational control of both my medical care and my sprawling commercial empire. When the hospital billing department presented a massive stack of complex insurance paperwork, she did not shrink away or demand a financial shortcut. She meticulously cross-referenced every single policy clause, aggressively negotiating with the administration to ensure the absolute best surgical team remained secured for the operation. Simultaneously, she kept the massive gears of Nadine Holdings turning without missing a single rotation. She fielded frantic phone calls from panicked senior yard managers, authorizing massive lumber shipments and redirecting supply chain logistics with the exact same cold, ruthless efficiency I had taught her. She drafted a concise, legally binding corporate memo to the board of directors, assuring them that the company remained completely stable and fiercely warning the recently defeated rival executives against attempting another blindsided attack while I was incapacitated. She slept in small, fragmented snatches on the hard vinyl chairs, surviving entirely on bitter cafeteria coffee and sheer, unbroken willpower. She did not seek out a broad shoulder to cry on or search for a convenient escape hatch from the crushing pressure. She stepped directly into the immense vacuum of my absence and operated as the fierce, unyielding protector I had meticulously trained her to be, holding the absolute line against total financial and medical collapse. The suffocating darkness slowly receded, replaced by the dull, throbbing agony radiating from my reconstructed sternum. I dragged my heavy eyelids open, my vision swimming, before finally locking onto the figure sitting perfectly still beside my hospital bed. Aaliyah was staring at the digital cardiac monitor, her posture rigidly upright despite the obvious crushing exhaustion weighing down her shoulders. Deep dark circles bruised the delicate skin beneath her eyes, a stark physical testament to the grueling 72 hours she had spent holding my entire world together. She turned her head, her gaze meeting mine with a steady, unbreakable calm. She did not offer a hysterical display of relief or dramatically throw her arms around my battered chest. Instead, she leaned forward and delivered a concise, highly detailed briefing. She explicitly outlined the total success of the surgical bypass, the exact current status of my medical insurance claims, and the flawless execution of the weekly commercial lumber quotas. I listened in absolute silence, the steady rhythm of the machines validating the profound truth staring back at me. She had completely carried the immense crushing weight of the corporate crown without fracturing the foundation or bending under the intense pressure of a life-or-death crisis. I saw absolutely no trace of the entitled, desperate girl who had once conspired to strip me of my wealth. The grueling transition of absolute power was definitively complete. I offered a single microscopic nod of profound respect, fully acknowledging that my grueling manufactured crucible had successfully forged a brilliant, ruthless successor worthy of controlling the empire. 2 agonizing weeks of grueling physical recovery crawled by before the chief cardiologist finally signed the official hospital discharge papers. He stood at the foot of my bed, outlining a strict, highly regimented rehabilitation program that required constant, dedicated supervision for the upcoming months. The medical mandate was absolutely clear. I could not return to my restored suburban sanctuary alone. Before I could instruct Maxwell to hire a team of elite, discreet private nurses, Aaliyah stepped directly in front of the doctor and firmly intercepted the medical charts. She stated with absolute non-negotiable authority that she would be personally assuming total responsibility for my physical rehabilitation. She explicitly intended to pack up her sparse belongings from the dingy studio apartment and permanently move back into her old childhood bedroom. She planned to manage the sprawling, multi-million-dollar operations of Nadine Holdings directly from my home office, while personally overseeing my daily cardiovascular therapy. The sudden, aggressive proposition hung heavily in the sterilized room, creating a profound, high-stakes standoff. Returning to the exact house she had maliciously attempted to steal just months prior required an entirely new, deeply vulnerable level of personal access. I stared into her unwavering eyes, painfully aware that allowing her to cross that specific threshold meant dropping the absolute final defensive barrier between us. The grueling corporate test had been successfully conquered, but the ultimate, most dangerous decision remained. I had to definitively decide if I trusted the newly forged steel of her character enough to let her step back into the sacred heart of my private sanctuary. Aaliyah steered my heavy sedan carefully into the wide paved driveway, executing the turn with the smooth, cautious precision I had observed in her daily management of the lumber yards. She immediately shifted the vehicle into park and moved swiftly to the passenger side, her movements completely stripped of any lingering hesitation. She firmly gripped my elbow, providing exactly the right amount of sturdy, unyielding support as I slowly navigated the steep brick steps leading up to the wide front porch. She did not release a heavy sigh or cast an annoyed glance toward the sky to signify her displeasure with the immense physical burden. She simply guided me safely inside and immediately took command of the quiet house. I watched from the worn leather sofa in the den as she methodically transformed my chaotic medical discharge paperwork into a perfectly streamlined, highly efficient daily schedule. She aggressively managed my complex medication routine with absolute precision, timing every single dose perfectly alongside the strict, low-sodium meals she personally prepared in the kitchen. Between monitoring my physical rehabilitation, she sat at the heavy oak dining table, with her laptop open, fielding rapid-fire calls from the senior yard managers and aggressively directing the continuous flow of the massive corporate supply chain. She operated entirely without complaint, radiating a quiet, undeniable efficiency that was firmly rooted in a profound, genuine love rather than a desperate obligation. The entitled, deeply manipulative daughter who had once attempted to rip the very foundation from beneath my feet had been entirely eradicated. The woman serving me a steaming mug of decaffeinated coffee was a fiercely capable leader who had finally learned exactly how to protect her family. The golden afternoon light filtered softly through the heavy velvet curtains, casting a warm, familiar glow across the polished hardwood floors of the quiet den. I sat deeply settled into the worn cushions of my favorite mahogany armchair, breathing in the rich, comforting scent of fresh lemon polish and dark roasted coffee. Across the room, Aaliyah stood before Nadine's antique curio cabinet, a soft microfiber cloth in her calloused hands. She carefully, meticulously dusted the delicate glass panes and the intricate woodwork, her movements slow, deliberate, and profoundly respectful of the fragile memories housed within. The deep, agonizing tension that had saturated the very walls of this house for years was entirely gone, replaced by a profound, unshakable peace. The sprawling, multi-million-dollar corporate empire I had spent decades bleeding to build was completely secure, actively thriving under the fierce, highly competent leadership of a woman who had physically earned the absolute right to command it. The devastating necessary crucible I had forced her to endure had yielded the exact result I had calculated. The ruthless, systematic elimination of the parasitic Brent and the complete agonizing demolition of her own toxic arrogance had ultimately saved our entire family legacy. The brutal, unyielding fire of absolute poverty had successfully burned away the thick layers of entitlement and greed, leaving behind only the solid, unbreakable oak of her true character. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the steady rhythm of my reconstructed heart, completely satisfied that the foundation was finally strong enough to outlast my own existence. The quiet sanctuary of the afternoon was interrupted by 3 sharp, authoritative knocks echoing against the heavy front door. Aaliyah stepped away from the curio cabinet, pulling the heavy oak door open to reveal Maxwell standing on the porch holding a thick, pristine leather briefcase. He stepped inside, his expression perfectly composed, and walked directly into the den. He opened the briefcase on the center of the glass coffee table, producing a massive stack of heavily stamped, meticulously drafted legal documents. These were not the desperate, frantic filings of a hostile corporate takeover or a punitive legal shield against a criminal ex-husband. They were the finalized, airtight trust documents and corporate succession contracts. I leaned forward in my armchair, accepting the heavy gold fountain pen Maxwell offered me. I did not clutch my chest or stage a dramatic fabricated medical emergency to test the loyalty of the room. I held the pen with an incredibly steady, completely unwavering hand. I methodically signed my name on every designated line, legally and permanently transferring the absolute full operational control of Nadine Holdings and the entirety of my accumulated wealth directly to Aaliyah. I handed the finalized documents back to Maxwell, who placed them securely into the leather briefcase with a satisfying, definitive snap. Aaliyah accepted the smooth-bound copy of the finalized trust. She did not display a sudden burst of unearned arrogance or crack a smug, victorious smile. She held the heavy paperwork with a solemn, profound gratitude, her eyes dropping to the calluses covering her palms. She understood with absolute, undeniable clarity the immense physical cost of the ink currently drying on those pages. A heavy, familiar knock sounded against the front door, far less formal than Maxwell's crisp arrival. Aaliyah pulled the door open immediately, stepping aside as Loretta bustled into the entryway. She carried a massive steaming casserole dish wrapped tightly in thick aluminum foil, the rich, savory scent of baked ziti instantly overpowering the sharp smell of the lemon polish. Loretta marched directly into the kitchen to deposit the heavy dish before turning back to the den, wiping her hands firmly on the front of her worn floral apron. She looked sharply at Aaliyah, noting the confident, grounded posture and the complete absence of the frantic, entitled energy that used to define her. Loretta then shifted her gaze directly to me, settling comfortably in my mahogany chair, with my decaffeinated coffee resting on the small side table. A wide, genuine smile broke across Loretta's face, softening the deep lines around her perceptive eyes. She placed her hands on her hips, her voice ringing with clear, affectionate warmth as she addressed me directly, asking if I finally had a full house again after all the agonizing chaos. I picked up my mug, feeling the warmth radiating through the ceramic against my palm. I looked across the room at my daughter. She stood tall, fiercely capable, and completely unburdened by the toxic greed of her past. She had survived the brutal fire and emerged entirely worthy of carrying her mother's name. I took a slow sip of the coffee, holding Loretta's gaze. I replied with a voice that was completely steady, deeply resonant, and entirely at peace, stating clearly that I did not simply have a full house. I finally had my foundation. Aaliyah steered my heavy sedan carefully into the wide paved driveway, executing the turn with the smooth, cautious precision I had observed in her daily management of the commercial lumber yards. She immediately shifted the vehicle into park and moved swiftly to the passenger side, her movements completely stripped of any lingering hesitation or reluctance. She firmly gripped my elbow, providing exactly the right amount of sturdy, unyielding physical support as I slowly navigated the steep brick steps leading up to the wide front porch. She did not release a heavy sigh or cast an annoyed glance toward the sky to signify her displeasure with the immense physical burden of caretaking. She simply guided me safely inside and immediately took command of the quiet house. I watched from the worn leather sofa in the den as she methodically transformed my chaotic medical discharge paperwork into a perfectly streamlined, highly efficient daily schedule. She aggressively managed my complex medication routine with absolute precision, timing every single dose perfectly alongside the strict low-sodium meals she personally prepared in the kitchen. Between monitoring my physical rehabilitation, she sat at the heavy oak dining table with her laptop open, fielding rapid-fire calls from the senior yard managers, and aggressively directing the continuous flow of the massive corporate supply chain. She operated entirely without complaint, radiating a quiet, undeniable efficiency that was firmly rooted in a profound, genuine love rather than a desperate obligation. The entitled, deeply manipulative daughter who had once attempted to rip the very foundation from beneath my feet had been entirely eradicated from existence. The woman serving me a steaming mug of decaffeinated coffee was a fiercely capable leader who had finally learned exactly how to protect her family. The golden afternoon light filtered softly through the heavy velvet curtains, casting a warm, familiar glow across the polished hardwood floors of the quiet den. I sat deeply settled into the worn cushions of my favorite mahogany armchair, breathing in the rich, comforting scent of fresh lemon polish and dark roasted coffee. Across the room, Aaliyah stood before Nadine's antique curio cabinet, a soft microfiber cloth in her calloused hands. She carefully, meticulously dusted the delicate glass panes and the intricate woodwork, her movements slow, deliberate, and profoundly respectful of the fragile memories housed within. The deep, agonizing tension that had saturated the very walls of this house for years was entirely gone, replaced by a profound, unshakable peace. The sprawling, multi-million-dollar corporate empire I had spent decades bleeding to build was completely secure, actively thriving under the fierce, highly competent leadership of a woman who had physically earned the absolute right to command it. The devastating necessary crucible I had forced her to endure had yielded the exact result I had calculated from the very beginning. The ruthless, systematic elimination of the parasitic Brent and the complete, agonizing demolition of her own toxic arrogance had ultimately saved our entire family legacy. The brutal, unyielding fire of absolute poverty had successfully burned away the thick layers of entitlement and greed, leaving behind only the solid, unbreakable oak of her true character. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the steady rhythm of my reconstructed heart, completely satisfied that the foundation was finally strong enough to outlast my own physical existence. The empire would never fall to scavengers or fools. The quiet sanctuary of the afternoon was interrupted by 3 sharp, authoritative knocks echoing against the heavy front door. Aaliyah stepped away from the curio cabinet, pulling the heavy oak door open to reveal Maxwell standing on the porch holding a thick, pristine leather briefcase. He stepped inside, his expression perfectly composed, and walked directly into the den. He opened the briefcase on the center of the glass coffee table, producing a massive stack of heavily stamped, meticulously drafted legal documents. These were not the desperate, frantic filings of a hostile corporate takeover or a punitive legal shield against a criminal ex-husband. They were the finalized, airtight trust documents and corporate succession contracts. I leaned forward in my armchair, accepting the heavy gold fountain pen Maxwell offered me. I did not clutch my chest or stage a dramatic, fabricated medical emergency to test the loyalty of the room. I held the pen with an incredibly steady, completely unwavering hand. I methodically signed my name on every designated line, legally and permanently transferring the absolute full operational control of Nadine Holdings and the entirety of my accumulated wealth directly to Aaliyah. I handed the finalized documents back to Maxwell, who placed them securely into the leather briefcase with a satisfying, definitive snap. Aaliyah accepted the smooth-bound copy of the finalized trust. She did not display a sudden burst of unearned arrogance or crack a smug, victorious smile. She held the heavy paperwork with a solemn, profound gratitude, her eyes dropping to the thick calluses covering her palms. She understood with absolute undeniable clarity the immense physical cost of the ink currently drying on those pages. She knew the weight of the crown. A heavy familiar knock sounded against the front door, far less formal than Maxwell's crisp arrival. Aaliyah pulled the door open immediately, stepping aside as Loretta bustled into the entryway. She carried a massive steaming casserole dish wrapped tightly in thick aluminum foil, the rich, savory scent of baked ziti instantly overpowering the sharp smell of the lemon polish. Loretta marched directly into the kitchen to deposit the heavy dish before turning back to the den, wiping her hands firmly on the front of her worn floral apron. She looked sharply at Aaliyah, noting the confident, grounded posture and the complete absence of the frantic, entitled energy that used to define her. Loretta then shifted her gaze directly to me, settling comfortably in my mahogany chair with my decaffeinated coffee resting on the small side table. A wide, genuine smile broke across Loretta's face, softening the deep lines around her perceptive eyes. She placed her hands on her hips, her voice ringing with clear, affectionate warmth as she addressed me directly. "You got a full house again, old man?" Loretta asked, her tone entirely devoid of the sharp reprimands she used to deliver. I picked up my mug, feeling the warmth radiating through the ceramic against my palm. I looked across the room at my daughter. She stood tall, fiercely capable, and completely unburdened by the toxic greed of her past. She had survived the brutal fire and emerged entirely worthy of carrying her mother's name into the future. I took a slow sip of the black coffee, holding Loretta's gaze. "No, Loretta," I replied, my voice completely steady and entirely at peace. "I just have my foundation." The screen slowly fades to black on a house completely restored. True power is never given. It must be forged in the relentless fires of accountability and personal sacrifice. Wealth without discipline creates destructive entitlement, blinding us to the fundamental value of honest labor and genuine human connection. The ultimate act of parental love is not shielding a child from the harsh realities of the world, but forcing them to build the resilience required to survive it independently. By stripping away artificial privileges, we directly expose the absolute core of our character. Only when you have nothing left to lose can you truly discover the unshakable strength required to protect everything. If this story resonated with you, please leave a comment below sharing your thoughts on Aaliyah and Jermaine's journey. Hit the like button, share this video with your friends and family, and subscribe to the channel for more powerful, compelling narratives.